The mountain woman demanded, "You're going to bed with me tonight." Cowboy couldn't refuse. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind howled across the desert, dragging red dust along the wooden porch. On the horizon, the sunset burned like a dying forge, leaving behind a night sharp and cold. In town, the scrape of iron boots echoed across the saloon floor, a hand brushing lightly against a gunstock as a stranger stepped inside, then silence. Out on the edge of the ranch, a lantern flickered on the table, casting the lone cowboy's shadow long across the creaking floorboards. Buddy let out a low growl. 3 knocks came at the door, soft, deliberate. A girl stood there clutching a small bag, eyes glistening with dew. "I need work and a place to stay." Jake's hand eased slowly off the gun. Tonight, the west would change. The desert wind whistled through the deserted town, carrying the scent of dry sagebrush and red dust thick on the wooden eaves. A lantern swayed outside the old saloon, pale yellow light spilling onto the empty street. The only marks on the ground, the deep grooves of horse hooves. Far off, a midnight train whistle cried through the night, the grinding steel wheels rolling along the tracks, fading into silence as if the whole west had taken a breath. Inside the rickety cabin on the edge of town, Jake Morrison sat alone at the table, the flickering oil lamp casting shadows across his weathered face. 35 years old, a quiet cowboy, hands calloused from wire and cattle eyes deep with unspoken years. His wide-brimmed hat hid half his face, revealing a gaze both hardened and weary, a man who had weathered storms but had yet to find his rest. His dusty boots tapped lightly on the floor, not impatience, but habit, a quiet rhythm of a man always on guard. Then 3 knocks. Soft but firm, unlike any wanderer, unlike any trick of the night wind. Jake rose slowly, his hand brushing the gun at his hip, sensing the shift this moment would bring to his life. When the door swung open, the night spilled around a small, fragile figure. Eliza stood there, clutching her little bag, hair tousled by the wind eyes shining in the darkness, equal parts desperate and unbroken. Her voice trembled, yet held a steel beneath it. "Please, I need a job and a place to stay." Jake froze. He expected trouble, not a plea. But in that instant, between caution and compassion, something quiet stirred in the heart of the lone cowboy. If you were the rider entering this town, what would be the first thing you'd do? Part 1. The first meeting. The night wind swept across the dry earth like a knife-flipping red dust carrying the scent of thyme and pine resin. On the outskirts of town, where the railroad tracks squealed and then fell silent as if swallowing their own sound, the oil lamp in Jake Morrison's wooden house flickered every time the wind slipped through the cracks between the boards. He sat silently at the table, his wide-brimmed hat shading half his eyes, his dusty boots set neatly on the old wooden floor. On the wall hung bridles, saddles, and a leather coat, disciplines of a cowboy's life, no matter how lonely. Buddy, the frost-specked black dog, curled on the straw rug near the hearth. He lifted his head when the faint clatter of the night train echoed, then settled again, ears twitching with the wind. Jake flipped through his ledger, the dry words listing fence nails, mineral salt coffee grounds. In the margin, a smudge marked a name, the ex-wife he had stopped writing, but not yet erased from his heart. He set the pen down, hearing his own heartbeat in the quiet house. 3 knocks sounded at the door. Not hard, not soft, just sure. Buddy sprang up, growling low. Jake's hand went to the gun instinctively. The clock hands were creeping toward midnight. He stepped onto the porch. The wind made the curtain rustle, hinting at rain on the way. He unlatched the door. The door opened, just enough for the night to frame a slight figure. A girl stood there, wearing a thin, dark sweater, damp with dew, clutching a small, worn canvas bag. Her hair was tousled by the wind. Her eyes, caught in the lamp's glow, were both wary and determined, like someone who had gone too far to turn back. She did not step inside, staying at the edge of the light, most of her body shadowed careful, like a deer, newly driven from the forest. A job, she said, her voice hoarse from the cold. Just a few days. I'll do anything. The wind carried her words away, letting them fall onto the floor, like a small stone dropping into deep water. Jake didn't answer. He studied her hands, cracked, reddened, still carrying the faint smell of cheap soap. He looked at the canvas bag, her whole life in one bundle. Buddy stepped half a pace closer, tail stiff as a dry branch. A silence thick as sun-baked leather settled. Suspicion lingered in Jake's gaze, but somewhere deep, something softer tugged at him, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long while. On the distant hills, the saloon had closed its lamps, and the clink of iron on the floor lingered in memory. Jake's hand left the gun. He pushed the door wide, not inviting, not refusing, simply making room for the wind and the choice of the woman outside. She hesitated for half a beat, then stepped onto a board that creaked underfoot. Buddy sniffed the dew on her skirt and stopped, growling. In the flickering lamplight, Jake heard himself whisper, barely louder than a breath, "Tonight. Come in." She stopped by the hearth, hands clasped together, cold dripping from her hair in tiny beads. Jake's house was simple. 1 table, 2 chairs, a bed against the wall, and a kitchen shelf with only salt coffee and a few dried beans. Everything was orderly, the way a man living alone keeps his few possessions in their place. The fire crackled pine smoke mingling with the scent of dry leather coats. Jake set a coffee pot on the cast iron stove. He was used to letting silence precede words. It was like a bridle keeping a horse from whinnying in the night. The girl's eyes roamed over the hooks on the wall, stopping at the carefully oiled saddle. She squinted as if reading the story in the scratches marks only those who had truly worked could recognize. "Name," Jake asked, voice low, each word ground like worn stone. "Eliza," she answered briefly. "Eliza Turner." Jake nodded like a period at the end of a sentence. He poured coffee into a scratched enamel cup and pushed it toward her. Eliza cupped it in both hands, blowing gently, sipping carefully as if afraid of waking something fragile inside her chest. Warmth spread over her cheeks. Buddy lay down again, head resting on his paws, eyes still watchful in loyal vigilance. "What can you do?" he asked, still leaning against the kitchen counter, shadow stretching. "Wash, cook, mend water, the horses, clean the stalls. Fix broken straps, sew torn saddles. I know how to repair buttons so they won't fly off in the wind." She listed without pride or pleading, simply reciting a life's invoice learned out of necessity. The west wind rattled a cupboard door. Eliza set the cup down, as if weighing her words. "I don't ask much. Just pay, and a place to sleep in the barn. I'll start before sunrise tomorrow." Jake said, neither yes nor no. He went to the hooks, took down a worn leather glove, its wrist seam split by a knife, and placed it on the table. Eliza understood, without further instruction. From her bag, she produced a roll of linen thread, a needle, and a scrap of fabric. She bit the thread to stiffen it, threaded the needle in one unshaking motion. The lamp cast her shadow on the wall, a slender but strong figure like hemp twine used to bind wood plain, yet unbreakable in rain. She stitched each seam, evenly pulling the thread just tight enough lips, pressed in concentration. When the fire popped, she flinched slightly, then steadied herself. Jake watched and recognized something only those who had held a gun knew: a person who knows fear, yet chooses to stand firm. The final stitch done, Eliza turned the glove, smoothing it, returning it. Jake tried it on hands, feeling the repaired tear fit snugly as if it had never been broken. Another deep nod, not for the needle, but for the story behind it. When things tear, there is still someone who knows how to mend. The straw barn out back, Jake finally said. There's a blanket. The double doors stick a bit. Push left first. It was the longest approval he could utter tonight. At the corner of Eliza's mouth, a faint smile appeared, like a thread just stitched thin, yet warm. They stepped into the yard. The night deepened. Stars scattered faintly overhead, like salt on a black table. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and lingering horse sweat in the wood. Jake's stable was as tidy as his kitchen's smooth walls. Clean troughs, hay nets hung low enough not to strain a horse's neck. At the last stall, Tempest, the black horse with a winter coat, stood still, ears flicking at the human approach. This was no ordinary horse to greet every hand. It watched, reading the rhythm of steps before trusting. Eliza stopped a few steps from the stall, not intruding. She set down her bag, unfastened it, taking out a handful of salt and a strip of soft cloth. I won't go in, she said to herself. I'll stand here and let it choose. Her voice lowered soft, like speaking to a feverish child. Tempest shifted weight, breathed, nostrils flaring. It paused, then took a cautious step to the door, head lowered as if weighing the choice. Eliza did not rush her bare hand. She dampened the cloth, wiped the doorframe, erasing the metallic scent and wind the odors horses dislike. She set the salt on the edge of the wood, withdrew her hand, and stood still. Not everyone knows, Jake said quietly, as if afraid to break the silence, comforting the animal. Salt first, hand after. Elsie started to say her name, then stopped, remembering he already knew. They need to be asked too, like people. Tempest licked the salt once, twice, cautiously, then lifted its nose toward Eliza's hand. She left her palm open, letting the horse decide. The tip of Tempest's nose brushed her wrist, sniffing the faint scent of cheap soap and long road sweat. It did not startle. Eliza remained still, the closeness standing firm on four legs. You asked for work, Jake said, eyes on the space between her hand and the horse's nose, where silent agreements often happen. It's not easy. Early mornings, late lunches, bitter wind, sweat, grit. I didn't come for easy, Eliza replied, her breath like smoke, but her words warm. Just don't chase me away while the night is long. A vein twitched in Jake's wrist, like a bridle when a horse wants to bolt. He nodded again, not to the woman, nor only to the horse, but to something he had left by the wayside, now returning to rest on the doorstep. A little trust before the new day has reason to doubt. The stall door creaked. Tempest stepped back, accepting the new boundary. Eliza tied her bag, gazing at the thin clouds drifting over the hill. In the distance, a banjo from the sow. She held the spoon, eating slowly, as if afraid of spilling the gratitude that the simple meal offered. By the third spoonful, her eyes stung. Not from the chili, perhaps from the warm liquid sliding down her dry throat, touching places long untouched. She lowered her head, tears falling onto the back of her hand, seeping into the hardened stitches. Eliza turned her face away, ashamed of herself. Jake saw, but he didn't stare. He kept eating the steady clink of his spoon against the bowl, like someone saying, "I'm here," without demanding an answer. Buddy rested his chin on Eliza's knee, a warm weight without expectation. She sniffled and laughed through her tears. "Your friend convinces better than you do." "Yeah," Jake nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching. "He's hired for that." She set down her spoon. "I don't want to be a bother. Just, if anyone asks, say I stayed overnight. I'll get up before the sun. I'll make this place worthy of the bowl of beans." Jake leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes calm like a pond waiting for the wind. He let memory drift past nights, returning to a place where only the wind remained. A man who had ridden across plantations learned not to make promises. Yet some things require no oath. "The barn," he repeated. "There's a blanket. Left door first." He paused, as if remembering something else. "Tomorrow, 10 southern fences got hit by the wind. I'll fix them. There's a grain pounder. We'll eat at noon." "Yes," Eliza replied, her yes falling to the floor like a stone finally finding its place. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a long scratch along her wrist, the old purple bruising to yellow. Without asking, Jake knew it came from a slamming door rather than a wire fence. He looked at the scratch. Like one examines a strange road, it told more than the owner wished to. "You know how to use a staple for binding?" he asked, shifting the topic to something she could answer. "Yes." "Tomorrow, pliers hang on the second hook." She nodded. Simple as that. Small agreements, weaving a net enough to keep the heart from slipping through the gaps. Outside, the night shrank dew settling like a damp blanket. Jake led Eliza to the straw barn at the back. The double doors were indeed stuck. He pushed the left first, then the right, the sound of wood scraping wood like the sigh of an old man. Inside, dry, fragrant straw piled high. In the corner, a small lantern, a neatly folded wool blanket, a water bucket, and a wooden tub. "Here," Jake said. "Lock from inside. Buddy stays on the porch. If the wind blows, pull this tarp." He pointed to a thick tarp hung on a nail. Eliza nodded, touching the blanket's edge, still smelling of sun-dried laundry. She set down her bag, smoothing the blanket as if getting acquainted with new ground. She meant to say, "Thank you," but the words felt too small for how the barn had opened like an umbrella in the rain. Jake lingered at the door, awkward for a second, the kind of awkward from a man unused to offering his hand for so long. He took the leather jacket from his shoulder and placed it over the latch inside. "Cold night," he said. "Use it for now." Eliza looked at the jacket. Weathered leather collar, worn shiny where it rubbed his beard. The smell of pine smoke of a man who had been to places no one waited. She pulled it close, folded it in half, hugging it to her chest. Something softened inside her chest, like a rope soaked for too long, finally loosening its knots. "My name is Eliza." She repeated, this time lighter, like a self-introduction to a new home. I work hard. I don't talk much. I won't run if there's a storm. Jake tilted his head, hearing a commitment he once longed to believe. Jake, he said. Morrison. He hesitated, then added a short sentence, a small anchor dropped into deep water. Tomorrow we'll see. He closed the door, letting the wooden latch settle into its groove. Outside, Buddy curled on the barn step, a warm shadow marking the threshold like a stamp of home. Eliza dimmed the light by one notch, lying on the straw, pulling the jacket over her shoulders. In the darkness, between breaths, she heard Jake's steps fade away, heavy, certain steps touching the earth like someone who knows every inch beneath their feet. She closed her eyes. The smell of leather straw, night wind mingled. In that space, she thought of her own gloved hands, the even needlework, the unbroken threads. Tears came again, but this time not salty. They tasted of fire kindled after a late meal of beans. In the main house, Jake extinguished the light. Before the fire died, he placed the newly mended glove on the table. His fingers touched the firm stitching. He did not pray, but in the silence, there was something like a quiet hope for dawn, for 10 southern fences, for a stronger pot of coffee than usual, for someone who would rise before the sun and touch the house with silent movements. The wind over the fields eased. In the distance, the night train had vanished beyond the hills, leaving cold rails under the moon. Buddy breathed evenly, like a forge, slowing after a long day. And between the two wooden houses, several dozen steps apart, a fine invisible thread stretched, connecting the name Eliza to Jake, like a soft rein linking a horse's head to a careful hand. Dawn had not yet come, but it already knew the way. In the West, some changes wait for no gunfire. All it takes is an open door, a warm bowl of beans, a jacket placed just right, and two people standing still long enough to hear their hearts quiet so that a new life light as a horse's breath can begin. Part 2. Understanding each other. Before the horizon flickered with its first hint of light, Eliza was already awake. In the hayloft, she draped Jake's leather jacket over her shoulders, pushed her hair back, and groped for the lantern. A thin wind seeped through the cracks, carrying the chill of dew-soaked prairie. Each step she took on the dry straw made a soft rustle, like someone whispering, "Take it slow." She unlatched the door, and Buddy was already waiting on the porch, his tail wagging, just so a ritual greeting for someone who had passed the first trial. On the cast-iron stove outside, she coaxed the fire to life, poured water, and dropped in a pinch of ground coffee. The flames leaned into one another, smoke rising straight into the morning breeze. She didn't drink it. She let the aroma sink into her jacket, her hands, the only warmth a person could wear on the inside. When the water boiled, she poured a cup and set it on the windowsill of the main house. No knocking, no words. Then she followed the plank walkway to the stable. Tempest lifted his head. The black horse didn't move much, only flicked his ears, listening to her measured steps. Eliza waited outside the bars, letting him approach on his own. She offered him salt, brushed the bars, murmured a few words so soft they were like a trickling stream across her palms. Tempest exhaled into her wrist, then lowered his head for her to free his tangled forelock from the tie. She combed his mane, ran her hands along his neck to check for stray tufts caught in the reins. In the distance atop the ridge, Jake leaned against a fence post, holding the cup of coffee she'd left. The smell of coffee mingled with dew and pine settling into his breath. From where he stood, Eliza was just a dark, slender shape behind the stable door, but her patience slowed everything. The hens ceased their aimless pecking, the cows paused their calls, even the wind stopped tugging at the door. He took a sip, and the bitterness tasted strangely sweet. Eliza moved on to the row of chickens' eyes, scanning wet feathers, clipped feet, and chipped beaks. She lifted each bird, gently wiped mud from their shanks, spread corn evenly on the ground. A young hen leapt suddenly onto her arm, leaving a small scratch. She didn't flinch, just whispered a soft shh, coaxing it like a stubborn child. By the time the sun peeked over the hill, Jake had returned to the yard, brushing his hand on his jeans and setting the empty cup exactly where she had placed it. He didn't call to her, didn't praise her, didn't give orders. But passing the barn, he hung an empty hook on the wall, just at Eliza's reach, so tomorrow she could hang something of her own. The silence between them shifted like a saddle newly adjusted to the right notch, settling without pinching. Before the sun had climbed to the height of a horse's shadow, they were already at the southern fence. The wind whipped across the grass sea, carrying the scent of damp earth and old iron. The barbed wire was torn in 3 places, wooden posts rotted in 2, and a corner had been pushed aside by a buffalo a night storm left behind. Jake hoisted his shovel. Eliza clutched a coil of wire and a bag of nails. He wanted speed. She moved deliberately, but her slowness was not sluggish. It was steady, measuring marking, looping straps, tensioning the wire just enough, leaving a slight slack so the wind wouldn't snap it. She wore gloves, but when she reached the toughest knot, she removed them, letting her skin touch the metal, feeling the harsh spikes with her fingertips. A wire snapped back, slicing across her middle finger. Blood welled. Jake handed her a handkerchief, short and firm, tie it. Eliza shook her head, dabbed a little blood away, then pressed the cut against the edge of her pants using a clean piece of fabric, and continued. "Don't be stubborn," Jake added his voice, low, not scolding. "Almost done," she replied, a thin smile appearing. "I'll patch it up myself later." Her words light as the wind struck a hidden spot in Jake, the spot he had silently stitched within himself for years. He didn't argue. He held the post steady, bracing it with his body, letting her work. Their breathing synced with the tension of the rope. Her hands moved with skill, not the delicate finesse of a tailor, but the solid, decisive touch of someone fixing a shelter amid a storm, unshowy yet precise. By noon, the rope was up. He stepped back to check a corner pull. She squinted against the sun. A gust of wind rattled the rope, but it didn't break. Eliza raised her temporarily bandaged finger, smiling to herself. That smile made the streak of mud on her cheek look like a fingerprint left on a precious object. Jake handed her the water bottle before taking a sip himself. She drank, wiped her mouth with her palm, and returned it. Their hands brushed over the still warm cloth, and a small electric spark ran up his arm, halting at the place where he usually hid his tremors. He turned away, pretending to check the post. A good almost slipped from his lips, but he swallowed it. Instead, he dug another hole, drove a new post this time, letting Eliza deliver the final strike. The hammer struck the wood with a deep echo, like a heartbeat, resuming after a pause. She pressed the last nail, let go of the hammer, and looked at him. No laughter, only breath. A fence was mended, and the wounds of two people partially healed, not with medicine, but with someone standing opposite, keeping the rope from snapping. On the way back, Buddy ran ahead, barking twice. In the middle of the field, a calf had gotten its leg caught in a loose wire of the old forgotten fence. Its mother bellowed helplessly, pawing the air. The calf struggled. The wire bit into its leg, red against brown fur. Jake raised his knife, ready to cut. "Stop!" Eliza shouted, her voice steady enough to halt the wind. She knelt beside the calf, fingers smeared with dirt and blood touching the tightened wire. "Hold its head," she told Jake. "Don't let it panic more." Jake knelt, cradling the calf's head between his arm and chest, close enough to smell the sour milk and damp earth of new life. The calf panted, eyes wide. Eliza slid her hands under the wire, finding the right knot. "Shh," she whispered to both the calf and herself. "Don't hurt anymore." She twisted, redirected the pull, using her body as leverage. Every movement was a stitch, though there was no needle. The wire gave. The calf kicked free, then froze in panic again. Eliza didn't scold or jerk. She draped a cloth over its eyes, shielding its world in a blink. "Nightfall will be less scary," she murmured, undoing the second knot. Once freed, she stepped back, pulling the cloth. The calf staggered to its feet and ran to its mother, who licked it, bellowing hoarsely, like someone just crying. Eliza collapsed onto the grass, hands trembling after the calm had done its work. Blood stained her nails, dark streaks running. Jake slowly stood, watching the mother and calf touch noses. Once so long ago, he had held a tiny body, hearing weak breaths, promising more than a man's strength could hold. Memories passed over him like a cloud. He placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. No lifting, no comforting, just a steady support. "Good," he wanted to say, but the words stuck. Instead, he wet the handkerchief from the water bottle and handed it to her. Eliza washed her hands, wiped the mud, rebandaged the finger cut that morning. She looked up. Water still glistened in her eyes, but at the corner of her mouth, a trace of a small trust appeared, like placing the first brick after a flood. Buddy flopped down, panting. Tempest neighed softly somewhere outside, responding to a signal unseen. The wind turned, carrying the scent of freshly mixed milk and broken grass across the field. "Let's go," Jake said, softer this time. They stood together, not rushing, walking past the removed wire, leaving behind the calf slurping as a lullaby for the afternoon. The afternoon heat lingered. Black clouds rose from the mountain flank, weaving thick strips of shadow. The wind changed twice in an hour, a sign of a coming storm. Jake checked the barn roof. Eliza tidied, rolled the tarp, stored the feed. By the first clap of thunder, the yard was neat as a freshly wiped table. A lightning bolt tore the sky. Tempest jumped, banging against the stall bars, front hooves pawing the floor. Not easily spooked, but the thunder was too close. The ground shook like a drum beside the ear. Jake turned back, seeing Eliza standing at the stall, hands on the bars, door closed. "Don't go in," he warned, voice rough from experience. "I won't," she confirmed, eyes on Tempest. She lowered herself, making herself small. "Here," she whispered, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a child in fever. "Here." A simple tone, not a song, but a mother teaching breath rhythm. She passed that rhythm into the space, slow in, out, slow in, out. Rain fell in thick drops, pounding the tin roof. Thunder rolled across the hills. Tempest pricked its ears, eyes flashing white, then lowered its head, listening to the invisible. "Good, Eliza," said softly, not praising, just affirming a right step. "Well done." She didn't touch. She let her present skin, rain-soaked clothes, lingering coffee scent bridge the distance silently. Jake stood by the door, hand ready on the latch to stop the horse. But he didn't need to. Tempest flinched once, then exhaled, sweat steaming in the cold rain. Eliza offered salt through the bars, palm open, a gesture unmistakable, not commanding. Tempest licked her hand, pressed its nose against her wrist, pausing longer than usual. She lowered her hand, leaving the victory inside the stall unclaimed. When the storm passed, the cool wind felt like a stream-cooled hand on a fevered brow. Eliza tilted her face to catch the last drops of rain. Mud streaked her cheek from earlier. Jake looked at her, the horse, and her hands, the hands that accomplished what many grand words could not teaching. Calm to silence, teaching stillness to panic. "Come in to eat," he said soft as the rain's end. Walking back to the porch, they moved side by side. Buddy circled behind, nudging a fallen tarp back into place, helping restore order to the home. Tonight, the cast-iron stove smelled of beans, stewed with salted meat, onions browned black pepper floating. Eliza hung her coat on a new hook Jake had placed that morning. She paused at a second empty hook, at just the right height her own. Without words, she touched it lightly with her torn finger, signing an invisible signature. Jake placed 2 tin bowls, adding a slightly burnt cornbread. They ate as if fixing a saddle neither hurried nor slowed the rhythm right, so the bread stayed intact. Spoon tapping matched the rhythm of hooves on dry ground. At the last bite, Eliza took out an old brass thimble from her pouch, placing it on the table. "This," she said, "I've used since I was 13. If you allow, I'll leave it here. Tomorrow, for stitching the saddle mending straps, easy to reach." Jake looked at the thimble, the worn edge scratches inside from years of needlework. He understood that an item worn from use becomes part of its owner, like a saddle hugging the rider's back. He nodded, placing the thimble on a small shelf above the table among salt, pepper, and a lone button left behind, not pushed in deep so it could see the fire. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll bring the old saddle out to dry in the sun. You oil it, I stretch the hide. Midday, we'll try it on Tempest." Eliza smiled. "You said we." Jake lifted his head, hearing himself. He didn't correct it. He poured hot water into the teapot, adding a few mint leaves she had dried on the line. Steam rose, opening a path in their chests. After dinner, Eliza washed the dishes. Water dripped in rhythm over the wood grooves. Jake carried out a small plank, drove 2 nails, hung a coiled rope for the needlework. She placed the thimble on it round as a new moon. Before returning to the barn, Eliza paused at the door. Part 3. Walking through the past. The wind slipped through the cracks of the door, whistling like a knife slicing through the darkness. Cold moonlight spilled through the small window, catching on tiny dust particles, drifting lazily in the wooden cabin. The oil lamp on the table flickered, its trembling yellow light brushing against Eliza's cheek and the brim of Jake's wide hat hanging on the hook. Buddy lay at their feet, ears twitching, with the gusts occasionally letting out a soft huff, as if to remind them he was on watch. Jake poured mint tea, setting it in front of Eliza without urging her. He sat across from her elbows, resting on his knees, back against the chair, leaving just enough space for her to fall into if she stumbled. Outside, the black railroad tracks stretched silently toward the sleeping town. Beyond them, desert, then mountains, then sky. Here, there were only the two of them and the lamp. Eliza gazed at the wooden tabletop, the ring stains from cups, knife scratches, tiny burn marks near the edge. Every mark. "It's like the cracks in a person's life," she whispered. "When people crack, they tend to hide it. Tables don't." She traced a scratch with her fingertip, as if touching a thread just slipped from its stitch. "No need to tell it," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "But if you do, I'll listen." He didn't press further, didn't stare. Just placed the sentence down gently, like a saddle settling on the back of a horse, fighting for breath. Eliza drew in a deep breath. "My home was eastward, more than 3 days by horse," she began. "My father worked as a laborer at a horse ranch. My mother did piecework sewing. When my mother died, people told me that death was a light debt because we were poor. I was 16. I stitched her shroud with cheap black thread, crying for the ceremony on the outside inside. I couldn't finish the stitching." She pressed her lips together, eyes blurred, then dried themselves. "I went to school. Little learned to read the ledger, count money so well. People said a girl who sews well would marry easily. They forgot to ask marry whom." The wind swept again through the crack, making the flame bend. Jake tilted the teapot, slightly pouring more tea without spilling a drop. Eliza looked at her palm scratches, bits of thread clinging, then lifted her cup. "I was promised to a stagecoach driver." He laughed loudly, said women who could sew could endure anything. I laughed back, but my stomach was salty as the sea. Her lips trembled slightly. I broke off the engagement. My father said nothing. Neighbors said too much. Some words were like barbed wire. They didn't bleed immediately, just cut gradually. Jake did not interrupt. He folded his hands, eyes darkening, as if he could hear the iron stirrups striking the saloon floor from far away. The night grew colder. Buddy lifted his head, pressing his nose against Eliza's pant leg. She gave him a faint smile, a thin, soft smile, then turned back to the lamp. "I left home on a night like this," she said, "carrying a bag of thread, my mother's brass thimble, and my grandmother's necklace. I thought I'd be gone a few days, then someone would call me back. No one did. The wind called first." A gentle silence settled between them, silence that demanded nothing, judged nothing. When Eliza lifted her eyes, a shadow appeared not from the lamp, but from memories just unlocked. And in Jake's heart, something shifted a little closer. Elkhorn Eliza said, naming a town as if placing a bruise on the table. I stopped there when I ran out of fare. Took laundry jobs, mending jobs. The boarding house owner let me sleep in the attic. I paid with thread. At night, I heard music from the saloon below, joyful like people are before they know exhaustion. I sat by the window, mending men's jacket, hems torn by gunpowder and liquor. The wind carried the laughter up. I sewed faster, as if stitching into that laughter itself. She blinked, fearing the real wind outside might suddenly bring back the past. One evening, a drunkard pounded on my door. He said I owed money, said I should pay in another way. I blocked the door with a chair. He cursed until morning. At dawn, the boarding house owner looked me over from head to toe like I was an old jacket not worth mending. She said I had dirtied the porch. I packed my things. From the stairs down to the door, I heard them call me by a name. That wasn't mine. Jake placed his hand on the table knuckles, whitening for a moment, then relaxing. He knew the names people used for convenience and judgment. Cheap as rusty nails, but they left marks on whatever wood they struck. At the market, a woman pulled her daughter away from me. The girl asked why. She said, "Because I don't want you to become..." Eliza left the sentence hanging. She let out a dry little laugh. Funny when people stick labels, they believe the label more than the flesh. I thought, if only they looked at these hands. Hands that know work, know care, know how to mend what they've torn. She lifted the hand streaked with cuts from the barbed wire this morning, regarding it like an ally. "And then you left?" Jake said, not a question. "I'll go." Eliza nodded. I sewed along the wagon roads, mending soldiers' uniforms. For leave, stitching the dresses of poor women who didn't have matching thread-patching saddle covers torn under the blazing sun. Nights, I slept in haylofts, listening to the night trains glide by like appointments I wasn't meant to keep. Some nights, I was hungry. Some nights, the track watchman gave me half a loaf when he saw how well I could sew. Some nights, coyotes howled, and I held my thimble in my hand, feeling its weight like a quiet reassurance. I learned to step quickly when unfamiliar boots followed. I learned to stand on the porch against the wind. I learned to keep my eyes open always. Jake's fingers brushed the teacup handle, tracing a crack in its old glaze. He asked softly, almost whispering, "Did anyone ever believe you?" Eliza blinked eyes bright with surprise. The question wasn't like the ones she'd endured before. "Who are you? What do you do?" It was more like a rope reaching across to the other side. "Yes," she said, surprised that the word came so easily. "A mother of a sick child. I came asking for water. She gave me some bread. Two told me to stay a while because it was cold. I sewed a shirt for her child and one for the doll. She said, 'If your needle can save something, just keep sewing.'" Eliza smiled softer this time. I held on to that sentence like a clean name. The wind cooled slightly, like someone had just closed a door on the porch. Jake leaned forward, adding oil to the lamp. The flame flickered, then steadied. "Here," he said slowly, "no one will call you by any name but your own." He fell silent, but the words lingered on the table, heavy as a blanket draped across Eliza. One night, it hailed Eliza continued. "Small stones, but so many." I crawled under a freight car arms, clutching my bag of thread, back wet and cold nose full of iron and muddy earth. In my shirt pocket, my grandmother's necklace was cold as a winter river. I thought of my mother. She used to say, "When the needle hits the cloth, you know where you stand." That night, I pushed the needle through unfinished fabric, hearing the tiny swish as it passed the threads. Each stitch down was a step, each stitch up a sunrise. I taught myself to sleep by that rhythm. She pulled a worn brass thimble from her pouch and set it on the table like a witness. The rim was polished smooth, the inside lined with grooves from countless needles. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "I keep it because when my hands tremble, it steadies them. And because when it touches my skin, I remember her standing by the door, holding a needle, saying, 'Don't pull too hard, you'll tear it more.'" Jake lifted the thimble, turning it in his palm like he was reading a tiny map. The lamp cast a halo around it. He set it back exactly where it had been. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked. "Through too many seasons of wildflowers blooming," Eliza answered as if she didn't want to count. I stopped at camps 3 weeks here, 3 days there. Each place I hung the thimble by the stove, mended torn things. When I left, they paid in coins, or bread, or a smile. Some by not speaking ill behind my back. I took it all. She smiled a smile full of gratitude for life's unusual wages. "Did you ever want to go back?" Jake asked, hands warming around his cup, as if spinning a thought into heat. Eliza looked toward the window, where the moon poured a silver scone across the floor. "Yes," she said plainly. "I wanted to go home, knock on the door, call Father. But I was afraid. Not afraid of being scolded. Afraid I'd see in his eyes that I had no place anymore." Her voice sank thin as breath mingling with the wind. People survive by knowing where they stand. I stood in the middle of the road, too long, afraid my feet would take root on land that belonged to no one. Jake understood that more than anyone. He sipped his tea, hearing the fire crackle like horses' hooves, keeping rhythm. "The day you knock on my door," he said slowly, "I think, if I open it, this house must be calm enough that even the wind lowers its voice." His eyes, usually cold as a weathered lake, shone with something fragile. "And I will open it." Eliza pressed her lips together as if to hide a soundless sob. She tilted her head hair, brushing the lamplight gold spilling onto her collar. "I know," she said. "An open door doesn't creak. That's the first sign of home." The words landed like a needle into torn fabric, precise, gentle, with no extra blood. She twirled the thimble eyes, scanning the walls, plain and clean. At another camp, she said, "I asked to help in the kitchen." The master nodded. The mistress said nothing. When I smiled at their little girl, a simple adult-to-child smile, she pulled the girl in, saying, "Go play outside with your father." I understood I was a shadow to avoid. Eliza exhaled. I washed dishes, hands red as winter apples. At night, I sewed a torn saddle for the master. In the morning, he paid fairly. The mistress escorted me to the gate early. She said nothing, but I heard, "Go on so I can fear less." Jake remembered the afternoon Eliza had calmed Tempest during the storm. The same woman standing before nameless panic, teaching it to breathe. "People fear what they don't know," he said. "Elkhorn fears women traveling alone." Eliza nodded. "And I fear men in threes. One, I see intent in their eyes. 3, the intent comes with laughter." She gave a dry chuckle, still gentle. "But I also met good people. A pastor lighting a lamp to guide me across a bridge at night. A young woman selling milk, telling me to drink a sip warm because the smell of milk pushes the cold from your belly. An old man selling nails, seeing me fixing a fence, gave me a bag of nails and said, 'So you don't have to use your fingernails as a hammer.' The room warmed with these unspoken names. Jake tilted his head, listening to the invisible steps passing through his home, leaving warmth behind. "Here," he said, "there's a hammer. Nails. Someone holding them." He laid his hand on the table, thick calluses, a newly healed scratch. Across from him, Eliza placed the thimble, a small gap between them. They didn't touch, yet leaned on the same quiet well. One night, Eliza went on, "I slept in a corn shed. The master said, 'No one must see you inside.' It rained, the roof, leaked water, dripped onto my neck. I used my coat as cover, clutching the thimble. I wondered if my whole life I only stitched others' rips, who would sew mine." She looked up frank, offering her wrist to the light. "Tonight, when you said, 'Here, No one calls you by a name that isn't yours. I thought, maybe the answer has just arrived. Jake turned to the fire as if too many eyes might snap the thread just sewn. Here, he repeated, we speak little, we do instead. He rose, opened a small wooden box, usually for nails now empty, and placed it on the table, nudging it toward Eliza. This for thread and needles. Keep it on the shelf, between salt and pepper, easy to reach. Eliza touched the box. Its lid clicked softly, a sound enough to let a life know it now had its own compartment. Outside, the wind shifted. On the roof, a pine branch scraped against the shingles, reminding that it was late. Buddy shifted in deep sleep. The lamp burned low, its golden glow, like a cupped hand. Eliza drew the necklace from her pocket, the delicate chain, the scratched locket. Grandmother's, she said, opening it. Inside a small scrap of cloth, not a photo. I had no picture of anyone. I kept a piece of fabric my mother used to cover her needle. I carried it, like carrying home. She slowly folded the locket, pausing over it. I tell this not to make you pity me. I tell it because people lighten when someone sees their pain without looking away. She looked up, eyes honest, not begging. You didn't look away. Jake leaned back, hand on the chair wrist, showing an old scar, straight, faint crossing bone like lightning over the sky. I know what it feels like to walk a road with no signposts. He said, voice low as iron scraping a saloon floor in memory. Long ago. I left one home unsure if another existed. There are things. Part 4. Reconciliation and recognizing connection. Dew from the night still clung to the grass when the first sunlight touched the eastern fence, as if someone had gently drawn back a curtain. The scent of damp earth and fresh pine resin lingered in the air, carrying even the faint hum of insects into the breath of the early morning. Jake had been out in the field already, a hammer dangling at his side, a coil of barbed wire resting near the base of a post. He measured, marked with white chalk on the wood. The straight, decisive line spoke more of hands accustomed to action than words. The iron spur on his boot scraped against a stone ledge, a crisp, dry sound, just enough for Buddy to lift his head tail, flicking lightly. Eliza arrived, draping a dark scarf around her neck, arms carrying a bag of nails and pliers. She paused for a half beat to listen, the cows chewing steadily, the wind brushing over the hills, the faint hum of wire vibrating like a string. The east wind swirling a bit, she whispered. Leave half a finger width slack, or it'll snap when night comes. Jake nodded, neither arguing nor rushing to agree. He stepped back slightly, giving her room to approach the fence post, a small gesture, like laying one's hand away from the gunstock. They worked in silence. Eliza held the post. Jake pulled the wire. At the second joint, she twisted. He fastened their rolls, shifting naturally, like the rhythm of breath. When a sudden gust whipped through the wire, twanged thinly. Eliza quickly pressed the latch into place, and Jake looped the auxiliary wire around in time, two movements meshing as if rehearsed. No one said good job, but in the corners of their eyes, a new light appeared. Coffee's on the doorstep, Eliza reminded him, as if invoking a ritual they had silently accepted. Jake simply said, He replaced a rotten plank with a new post. Eliza lined up the nails, handing them one by one, matching the rhythm of his raised hand. Occasionally, she shared small anecdotes, the young hen laying an early egg tempest, letting her mane be brushed longer than usual. Buddy learning to fetch a tether. Jake didn't smile, but his shoulders lowered slightly, like a man realizing he'd been wearing armor too thick. The sun climbed higher, dew retreating from the grass in dark streaks. The scent of the saddle oil from yesterday lingered on Jake's hands. Eliza looked at the white chalk marks on the post, lightly wiping them away once the task was complete. "Nice," she said, pointing to the evenly stretched wire. Jake tucked the hammer into its loop eyes, tracing the fence running straight to the hilltop like a sentence punctuated perfectly. Inside him, a stiffness softened the silence between them. Was no longer a wall, but a rug spread out to sit closer. At the fourth joint, Jake's hand slipped on a jagged piece of wire, a cut slicing across his skin. He hid the reflex to pull back a habit of someone used to enduring. Eliza saw the red streak along his thumb joint. She opened her bag, took a clean cloth, and gently wrapped it. "I'll stitch your sleeve later," she said, "so the cuff doesn't rub the cut." Jake was about to say, "No need," but the words sounded meaningless. He just nodded. They rested by a birch tree. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering golden patches on Jake's brown sleeves. Eliza poured water into the cap and offered it. He took a sip, eyes wandering to the pasture where a calf was grazing. "Do you ask why I live alone?" he croaked, voice rough as saddle leather rubbing against his trousers. "Eliza doesn't ask," she replied. "But if you want to speak, I'm here to listen." That simple sentence turned the lock in his chest. Her name was Hannah, Jake said. For the first time, he spoke the name aloud between them. She smiled with her whole cheek. When she forgot to season soup, she'd say, "Tasteless food makes you appreciate bread." She liked tying blue ribbons to the post to mark tender grass. I told her to look far, like drops of sky falling to earth. He let out a small, dry laugh, unused for so long. That winter, our child was born. Tiny. Lived 3 days. I was changing a neighbor's horseshoes. When I got back to the porch, the wind had died inside the house. Eliza did not reach for him, nor did she pull away. She set the cap down, arms hugging her knees, chin resting on them, listening. Jake stared at the ground between his boots. I held the baby. He continued, voice low, like stones dropping in a well. Heavy as the skylighter, then a hat. I buried the child on the knoll behind the hill between 2 lavender bushes. Hannah didn't cry in front of me. She went to light lamps for neighbors, told me not to turn off our lights. The next winter, she coughed, skin parched. The medicine came later than the storm. The morning wind stirred the leaves. Sunlight danced over the back of Jake's hand, clenching, releasing. I once said this to a wooden post, he exhaled, but never to a person I wasn't there when it mattered most. Eliza tilted her head. You were there the next 3 days and the years after. Jake shook his head. I only knew work. The hammer spoke for me. The horse replaced sleep. I sold the unfinished wooden cradle. When they carried it away, I couldn't watch. His voice scratched, but didn't break. Above them, a flock of starlings chattered. Beneath, dew had vanished, leaving just right dry earth, as if someone had wiped it clean with a soft cloth. Eliza took out her bag, pulling out a thimble needle and flax thread. Show me your sleeve, she said. Jake unbuttoned the cuff, offering the worn fabric. She stitched the inside seam stitches, hidden almost invisible. Her fingers glided, tying tiny knots concealed like someone who wants the object to continue living, not to display the repair. My mother used to say. Eliza smiled softly. Stitching lets things continue their purpose, not to show off skill. Jake watched her hands. Fine cracks, calloused lines, nails trimmed short. And you? He asked, who stitches you when you need it? Eliza looked up. Sunlight caught the rim of her eyelids, making her dark pupils glisten like rainwater. I learned to stitch myself first, she replied. But last night, when you said, here, no one calls me by the wrong name, the needle moved more gently on its own. She bit the thread, smoothed the fabric edge, tucking the needle into the thimble. All done. A strong gust made the new fence shiver. Jake touched the spot Eliza had sewn just fabric, but it felt like touching a wound that no longer burned. He inhaled the minty scent from the thimble mingled with the cheap soap on her hands, the smell of a home freshly washed and sun-dried. From the hill, a lonely freight car rumbled along abandoned tracks, iron wheels clicking like a distant heartbeat. Eliza watched, then shared a small story, tossing it like a pebble across the bank. When I first left home, I once missed a train. I cried because I was scared. A child's mother handed me a cloth and said, cry it out, then eat. I ate half a dry bread. Turned out the train still arrived the next morning. Jake smiled this time, letting his lips remember the way back. Hannah said the same, he recalled. Or, eat first, then the sky will sort itself out. They stood up and moved on to the next fence post. Eliza made the connection. Jake tightened the wire. Buddy watched the ends, and Tempest perked her ears from afar. Each hammer strike, each twisted knot seemed to weave the story of the two of them without tension, without justification. At times, the wire snapped back, nearly hitting Eliza's cheek. Jake's hand shot up just in time to block it. The faint red mark on his wrist replaced the unspoken "be careful" he hadn't yet voiced. She saw the mark and gave a small nod. My turn. She swapped places to take on her share of the risk. In that moment, they held each other's gaze a beat longer than usual, the rhythm of people who recognize that kindness is also a responsibility. By noon, they stopped at the main house's porch. Eliza set a pot of beans sprinkled in some pepper and broke a half piece of cornbread. Jake stood, silently staring at the hook next to his own, where Eliza's leather jacket hung, as if it had been there for ages. When they finished eating, he said, I have something. He led her to the storage shed and climbed the loft. Dust floated in the sunlight, streaming across the rafters, each speck like a fragment of time made visible. Jake pulled out a wooden box, its rusty latch opening with a soft click. Inside, a small piece of white fabric embroidered with an H, a tiny pair of woolen socks, never worn, a faded pale blue ribbon, and a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its writing faded. Jake didn't touch them. His hands hovered, as if afraid that contact might make these things even more fragile. I've never opened this box in front of anyone, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, because the loft allowed only things light enough to whisper. Eliza sat beside him, folding her skirt to keep it clean from dust. She reached out, but paused midway waiting. When Jake nodded, she gently touched the pale blue ribbon. Hannah tied it to the post, Jake explained, to mark the young grass. I used to tease her about loving the colors of the sky. She said, mark it, so next time we know to be thankful. He smiled, then the smile cracked into a short, breathless laugh. I put this ribbon away the day we carried the baby to the hill. I thought marked the place of pain. But the more I hid it, the more it cried out. Eliza removed her scarf, tore a thin strip, and braided it into a small cord. "Take it with you," she suggested, "not to remember the pain, but so you don't get lost when the weather is good." She looked straight into his eyes, neither avoiding nor lowering her gaze. "What's kept isn't a mistake, it's love." Her words were short, direct, heavy enough to still the wooden boxes trembling. Jake placed both hands on the lid, then let go. "The day I buried my child," he said, "Hannah asked me, 'Can you promise to live without remembering?' I didn't promise, so I stayed silent, and from then on acted as if I had forgotten." He looked at Eliza. Turns out, not promising was the worst promise. His lips pressed together, his eyes wet, but unshed. Eliza didn't wipe his tears. She simply nudged the box closer, letting him arrange the contents as one would care for their horse's saddle. They sat like that amid dust and sunlight, long enough to let their hearts return to a slower rhythm. When they rose, Jake folded the ribbon carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "We'll hang it on the east fence," he said, "where the young grass is this afternoon." Eliza nodded a new ritual, waiting for them to name it. The afternoon leaned low, but the light still poured like slow honey across the hillside. They carried the ribbon and the coil of barbed wire. At the 12th fence marker, where young grass grew thick and the soil was soft, Jake tied the ribbon in a double knot. It fluttered in the wind, its faded blue still recognizable. Buddy sat tilting his head as if understanding this was no game. Tempest let out a short neigh from afar, then fell silent, the sound like someone saying, "Yes, I approve." Eliza Jake called his voice clean, like freshly sanded wood. "Thank you." Just 2 words. But they landed in the right place, like a fence snugly secured. She smiled, offering no reply. They both watched the ribbon for a few minutes, long enough to notice the wind had shifted direction. "The wind changes," Eliza said. "It shifts with the good season." They packed up and prepared to leave. On the way, Eliza misstepped into a small hole. Jake caught her elbow just in time. His hand was warm, steady, and then let go no longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said. "You too," she replied, looking down at her boots, then up again, straight ahead. 2 reminders, not warnings, but humble promises to protect each other. Back at the porch, Eliza hung her jacket on her hook. Jake glanced, then added another empty hook beside it. "For another day," he explained. "When you want to hang something else besides your coat." Eliza placed the thimble on the shelf, straightened it, and used a small piece of charcoal to write one simple word: home. She didn't look back, but clearly heard Jake's faint sigh, the breath of someone loosening a knot tied too long. Night fell again. Dinner was the bean dish, a little less salty, as half-jokingly promised. They ate without much conversation. Later, Eliza lit the lamp on her windowsill, her own light. Jake stood on the porch, watching the east fence. In the dusk, the ribbon looked like a young moon caught on the wire, neither falling nor breaking, needing no one to hold it, yet flying to the wind's rhythm. Before closing the door, Jake spoke, his voice low but steady. "There are things I cannot give back to her. But this morning, thanks to you, I realized I can still give back to tomorrow." Eliza tilted her head, her eyes deep as a water hole after a dry season. "Tomorrow always accepts," she replied. "As long as we bring it." Buddy curled up near the warehouse door, keeping watch over the night. Tempest grazed in the soft field, exhaling thin wisps of smoke. On the east fence, the blue ribbon moved gently like a hand signaling to what they had lost and what they still held. Inside the house, two people had given each other something that neither gun storms nor the heaviest words could take away the feeling of being truly heard and through it being alive again. Part 5. Returning to the past. The afternoon fell softly like a sun-warmed blanket. On the porch, two wooden chairs sat side by side overlooking the golden fields left behind after the hay had been cut. The sun lingered on the ridge, pouring honeyed light over the eastern fence, where a pale blue ribbon fluttered in the wind like a thin stream flowing backward from the earth to the sky. Buddy lay stretched across the steps, his ears twitching with every rustle of grass. In the stable, Tempest nudged the bars with his nose, exhaling a cool breath as if blowing out some old frustration. Jake leaned back against the porch post, his wide-brimmed hat hanging on a hook behind him. His jacket smelled of leather smoke, the day's sun, and the hammering on barbed wire. Eliza sat to his left, hands wrapped around a still warm enamel mug. A gray cloth, draped over her shoulders, darkened the hue of her eyes by a notch, like a lake catching a drifting cloud. A light breeze swept through the porch, carrying the scent of damp earth, from the drainage swirling a few golden aspen leaves around the chair legs before settling in a corner of the steps. "Today," Jake murmured, as if afraid to wake the birds sleeping on the roof. The wind changed direction twice. "A new season is coming." Eliza nodded without looking at him. Her gaze slid across the meadow, over the fence, landing on the black rails stretching straight toward the town. In the distance, a train whistle blew, then faded into silence, leaving a space in the air like a word erased from an unfinished letter. The wind shifted again, carrying a strange scent, this time baked goods from some house over the hill, or perhaps just the memory of pastries once set on someone's kitchen table in the days before fear had learned her name. Eliza closed her eyes for a second, her lashes brushing her cheek. Her lips softened, but her jaw stiffened. Jake noticed the subtle shift, small enough that only someone trained to read quiet signs like him could detect the ripple beneath the surface. He set the mug down and leaned slightly toward her, just enough to not touch. "Do you remember them?" His voice wasn't a question probing, but like a thread cast across the other end, waiting in her hand. Whether she took it or not was up to her. Eliza didn't answer immediately. A few more leaves drifted down. Buddy shifted position. Tempest shook his mane. The sun slipped slightly behind the hill, the sky shifting from honey to red bronze. Finally, she turned her head, gazing at the corner where the porch post met the roof, where evening shadows usually pooled like ink. "They've forgotten me," she said softly, like exhaling. There was no resentment in her words, just the truth, placed gently with both hands. And because she set it down with both hands, it didn't fall. Jake didn't respond with words. He placed his hand on her shoulder, slow and steady, like settling on the back of a horse that's breathing hard. Just enough weight to calm the trembling, just enough for his hand to know it could soothe something in this world. Eliza didn't lift her head, but her shoulder beneath his hand stopped tensing. The wind, too, ceased telling its stories so loudly. To the east, the blue ribbon still fluttered, but it seemed to have realized it was flying in the right place. "What do you mean by forgotten?" Jake asked softly, after a long enough pause for them to hear each other's breathing. Eliza rotated the enamel mug, listening to the metal tap, the wooden floor, a faint echo like the clink of spurs on a saloon floor long ago. Passing through the market, she said, seeing a wicker basket just like the ones Mother used to bring home. But no one remembers asking me to help carry it. Stopping by the communal well, seeing the new bucket and the children. None of them knew my name, yet nothing was missing. She looked across the fields, her voice even steady. Once I stood at the edge of the road when the missionary wagon passed. I heard singing for a long time. When they stopped, I saw a man, like a father, but not my father anymore. He bent down to tie the shoes of a little girl, her hair tied with a yellow ribbon. There was no space left in the family for me to stand. I stayed there until my shadow stretched as long as a lamppost. Then I left, like a stranger who had paused by chance. The wind scraped lightly against the door frame, carrying 2 or 3 grains of sand that dusted Eliza's palms. She rubbed them like scratching a mosquito bite that was itchy yet too trivial to complain about. I used to write letters. She continued, eyes never leaving the fading horizon. 1, then 2. I wrote Father's name on the envelope, then erased it. Not for fear of scolding, but for fear he'd read it and not remember who wrote it. Mother was gone to receive letters. Others, they had their lives. I left just as they learned to live without me. Jake tilted his head, hearing the unique sound of sadness that doesn't call out, but settles deep. He understood the feeling of watching someone else's life close doors without needing to be angry. I've forgotten someone too, Eliza said, her voice carrying a thin, painful smile at the corner of her lips. Forgetting by not daring to remember. That too is a way to forget. She glanced at him briefly, then returned to the fields. But tonight, I'm not telling this to recall them. I'm telling it to understand why my shoulders feel lighter sitting here on this porch. In the stable, Tempest pawed at the straw floor, like keeping rhythm to a song no one taught. Buddy lifted his head, listened, then lowered it again, trusting that everything was in its place. On the fence, the blue ribbon dipped slightly, then fluttered up again, like someone learning to breathe after a long run. Eliza took a deep breath. The scent of damp earth, leather wood, and smoke lingering in Jake's jacket. These smells didn't belong to the past, but to this home this afternoon. The day your wife died, Eliza said softly. You started calling her name less, didn't you? Jake nodded. It's in my head, he replied, but the lips hesitate. Every time I say it, I feel it catch in my throat, leaving a mark. He paused, running his knuckles along the porch post, listening to the deep, steady reply of wood, like an answer from an old man. Hannah, he said the first time he spoke the name on this porch in years. No thunder, no cracks, only the wind passing by, leaving the scent of freshly touched grass. Thank you, Eliza said, as if the name had unlocked a door inside her. As for me, she continued, I avoided saying Father's name. I replaced it with that house, with when I was there. She raised her hand, touching her neck, where the locket lay warm beneath the cloth. A name left unspoken for long enough learns to stand still. Then people assume it's dead. It's not. It's just waiting not to be pulled out to do anything but live. Jake leaned in his elbow, lightly brushing the back of the bench where her arm rested. Here he said, "You can speak it or not. No one makes a name testify to anyone's pain." Eliza smiled faintly. Her laugh was gentle, like the even breath of a horse after a long slope. "Do you know," she asked, "that when someone places their hand on your shoulder at the right moment, your own name feels warm again?" Jake didn't answer. His hand remained on her shoulder, warm, steady, speaking the unspoken condition. Here, he remembered her name. On the hill, a flock of geese flew in a V, their calls clattering like tiny nails dropping into a box. They flew slowly, shifting formation as the wind changed, keeping distance so no one grew too tired. Eliza looked up, eyes sparkling in the last light of day. "They know how to take turns leading," she said. "When tired, the one in front falls back." Jake looked up, remembering the years he forced himself to stand always in the strongest wind. Tomorrow, he blurted, "Let me fall back for a while." Eliza turned, her real smile returning to her lips. "Tomorrow," she repeated like a firm period at the end of a sentence. Dusk fell. The porch shrank to a thin strip of light between two dark spaces. Eliza asked for a piece of paper and borrowed Jake's old fountain pen, the kind he used to record salt and fence nail purchases in a wooden box. She set the paper on the small table on the porch, leaning over. Buddy perked up, lying beside her feet, occasionally sighing as if reminding her to shift so she wouldn't go numb. Jake didn't ask what she was writing. He pulled out a small knife, the type used for trimming fence posts, and sat by the porch post beside her. Eliza wrote slowly, her letters slanted, hesitant at first, then flowing. "Father," she began, then crossed it out and wrote again. She wrote, then paused, as if hearing when the last letter of ink dried on the paper, she folded it, leaving no address. "I'll put it in the box." Eliza said, her voice soft as velvet, "just to know I've said it. No one needs to answer." Jake nodded. He understood that letters never sent still carried their own weight. They allowed the heart to stop standing guard at the gate. He flipped the small knife and began carving a tiny E into the porch post, not large, not flashy, just enough so that a hand brushing by would notice. The wood creaked with the gentle thud of two old friends chatting in the rain. Eliza watched lips brushing a smile that eased her chest. "Aren't you afraid someone will see?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "People rarely notice what doesn't make a noise," he replied. "And if they do, they'll see the letter next to the J." He carved an additional stroke, neat and certain, like a needle passing through two layers of cloth. E and J stood side by side, neither crowding the other, both with space to breathe. Eliza opened her locket, threaded a thin flax string through the E, and let a short piece dangle teasing in the wind. "For the things torn that we've mended," she said. "For the names that one day will stand still, no longer needing to hide." At the edge of the porch, the pale blue ribbon to the east seemed to wave as if welcoming another soul into the house. Night fully settled. The stars revealed quiet breaths of the universe. The wind had softened only cool enough to remind one to pull their coat a little higher. Jake brought out an old tin plate and set it on the porch. Eliza placed the folded letter atop it. They did not read aloud, nor did they silently pray. Jake struck a match. The small green flame, cat-like at first, turned golden as it touched the paper's edge. The letter curled black at the borders, then glowed red like embers. Thin smoke rose, carrying the scent of ink paper, the sweat of the writer's hands, and the smell of years unnamed. Eliza watched until only fine ash remained. She scooped a handful and sprinkled it at the base of the post where E and J had been carved. "Let the ashes return to the earth," she said. "The letters stay." Buddy shook his ears, sneezed, then curled up, as if simply knowing the two people sitting here was enough. In the stable, Tempest snorted, tilting his head, acknowledging the human ritual just conceived. "Do you think Jake asked they will remember you again?" Eliza looked at the stars, eyes bright but dry. Maybe she answered, or maybe not. But remembering or forgetting is no longer what makes me stay. She turned, placing her hand over his palm, resting open on the chair. A touch, without asking, without withdrawing. Because here, someone calls my name right every day. That's enough. Jake did not squeeze, did not tremble. He simply laid his other hand over hers, holding it like a blanket over someone recently ill, neither too heavy nor too light. Here he said, "If one day you forget yourself, I'll remind you." The words came slowly, without stutter. They lingered between their hands, warming together. From the east, the wind carried the damp scent of a night promising late rain. The pale blue ribbon fluttered once more, then settled as if it had found a rhythm with this porch. On the post, the letters E and J rested close. The lantern light made them appear like two backs sitting beside a fire. On the windowsill, Eliza's brass thimble stood between salt and pepper, reflecting the flame into a small circle of light. They sat longer, needing no words. The smallest sounds of the house, the door contracting in the wind. Buddy's drowsy steps, the rope swaying and tapping, became a lullaby to carry them through the remaining night. When she rose, Eliza gently touched the E on the post, as if touching her own forehead. Jake lowered his hat back, on-looking past the eastern fence. Tomorrow, there would be dew there, and young grass leaning on it to grow. Before closing the door, Eliza paused at the threshold and looked back. "Jake," she called, for the first time shedding a layer of distance. "Thank you for letting me speak without needing permission." Jake nodded his hand, brushing the J in response. "Thank you for staying when the wind urged you to leave," he said. The door closed quietly. Night curled around them. Behind the porch, the letter's ashes had merged with the earth, ready to nurture a tender blade of grass where a human often sat. And in front of the porch, two hooks hung, one with a coat, one empty, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, with names called rightly, neither hurried nor lost. Part 6. Challenge and Confronting Pain. Rain fell in heavy sheets, pounding against the tin roof, with such force that Buddy had to press himself close to the gutter to avoid the splashing backwash. Wind slipped through the cracks of the window, rattling the fabric curtains, and carrying into the house the smell of wet earth and beaten-down weeds. On the table, the oil lamp flickered like a fevered hand, casting a wavering golden glow across the wall where the letters E and J were carved outside on the porch. Eliza was drying her rain-tangled hair with a coarse towel, her hand still carrying the faint scent of feed from tending the chicken coop. Inside the stall, Tempest huffed white steam puffing from his nostrils, his hooves tapping lightly on the straw whenever thunder rolled across the hillside. The clip-clop of hooves splashed sticky mud across the dirt road. 2 sharp knocks came at the door, urgent yet polite. A county mail carrier, clad in a black oilskin coat, extended an envelope sealed with a red wax stamp blurred by the rain. For Mr. Jake Morrison, he called over the downpour. Notice from the River District Magistrate. Then he pulled his hat low, nudged his horse, and disappeared into the curtain of rain. Jake turned the key in the envelope, his fingertips chilled by the wet paper. The letter inside flapped with the gusts that swept through the door, the ink bleeding into gray-blue streaks. He read slowly, line by line, eyes lingering on the bold words, resettlement, riverside land, allotment, priority for landless households, wounded and reconstructing families. Below the date and time to assemble at the old plantation near the ferry, instructions for the lottery, and a list of suggested supplies. A thinner line of ink added single individuals with livestock experience are encouraged to register to form a new community. Eliza stood across the table, eyes fixed on Jake's face, where the usual tight lines now shifted. When he reached the words, new community, his hand brushed the edge of the table, the same spot where Eliza had once set a brass thimble between salt and pepper. Thunder cracked again, the house shivering lightly. The scent of rain intensified, teasing Jake's nose with the temptation of new land, the smell of fertile silt, untouched wood riverside grasses, promising thick pasture for cattle. Good opportunity, Eliza said, first not to persuade, but as if naming a door that had just opened. Jake folded the letter, smoothing the damp crease. Maybe he replied, his voice deeper than usual. Then he fell silent inside his mind. The blue ribbon on the eastern fence fluttered to a different rhythm. They want people who know their work, he added, almost to himself. They want a quick start before the flood. The wind whipped, rain pelted the door. Fence nails clinked on the porch like someone tapping out the rhythm of a decision stretched between 2 banks. Eliza wrapped the towel tighter around her neck, looking at the wet letter still legible. She knew the scent of a beginning fragrant and salty, like a fresh ladle of soup brushing hot lips. She also knew the scent of parting rain-soaked coat backs, the tang of oiled reins, the smell of a dog tethered at the fence because its owner must leave. She looked at Jake, didn't ask. In the house, the rain sounded out a question, already standing between them, without needing to be named. By evening, the rain had thinned, though cold wind still pricked through the boards. Jake set the letter on the shelf beside the wooden box holding the blue ribbon. He opened the closet and pulled out an old oilskin coat, a leather hip bag, laying them on the table like someone testing how to pack a life into a bag. Eliza said nothing, neither don't go nor you must go. She lit the fire, set a pot of beans on, added a few dried rosemary sprigs. The warm scent rose, pushing back the wet clothes smell. The ferry is a day's ride away. Jake calculated, eyes on the water-streaked window. Early morning meeting. Leave tonight, arrive tomorrow. He tucked rope, a flint, a dagger, a small bag of coffee, and some dried food into the leather bag. His hand paused at a small wooden button, one his ex-wife had kept in a box. He hesitated, then left it out. Eliza noticed the pause and felt an invisible string tighten across her chest. "I've got it here," she said, eyes on the pot of beans. "The crowded fence, the chickens, Tempest. I can manage for a few days." Her words weren't proof, but a proposal to share the burden. Rain softened, tapping the roof like someone strumming a quiet rhythm. Buddy came and rested his chin on Jake's boot, eyes moist. "You stay home," Jake whispered. "Watch the porch, watch her." He packed quickly. The saddle had been oiled the day before. He checked the bridle and stirrups. Tempest sniffed his palm, dark eyes questioning. How long this time? Jake fastened the saddle, patted the horse's neck. "Just going to look," he said, mostly to hear himself say it. On the porch, Eliza split a cornbread in half. One half stayed on the table, the other wrapped in a dark cloth handed to him. "Rainy roads make hungry," she said. Between the rain's rhythm, they completed 100 small tasks, like any other day rituals to steady the heart before change. Jake jammed the door. Eliza stuffed rags under the stove to stop splashes together. They checked the hay basket, hung the wet coat on her hook to dry faster. Their hands brushed a few times lightly, fleetingly, like the fence swaying in the wind. Each touch carried something both promised and feared. When the packing was done, Jake slipped the letter into the coat pocket. The ink had dried into dark streaks like leaf veins. He looked at Eliza. She nodded. That was enough for him to know she wouldn't promise to stay untroubled, but she promised to keep the house bright. Night settled around the house like a deep pool. The rain no longer poured, but whispered like someone tapping gently on the roof. Eliza laid out thimble needle and thread on the table. Jake removed his wide-brimmed hat, pushing it toward her. "Mend this tier for me," he said, pointing to the hatband that had once sagged under sun and wind. She nodded, threading the needle, stitching evenly. Each stitch felt to Jake like a tap against his own heart. Not pain, just a reminder that something was being strengthened to endure another stretch of road. "Let me sneak 3 extra stitches," Eliza whispered, the seam nearly complete. "Memory stitches for you to touch when your heart feels empty. Inside, only no one will see." She stitched 3 tiny stitches with blue thread, the same shade as the ribbon on the fence between the leather and felt. "If one day you don't need them," she said, "cut them yourself. No one will be angry." Jake traced the tiny stitches with his finger, inhaling the familiar scent of leather mingled with the cheap soap on her hands, the smell of home. He took the old blue ribbon from the shelf, braided it with a fresh piece Eliza had torn from a cloth, and tied it neatly around the saddle knob, subtle just enough to notice. Eliza watched quietly, her eyes bright, like someone adding a last log to a fire just as it begins to die. Buddy shuffled closer, resting his head on Jake's lap. "What do you fear most?" Eliza asked softly. Jake thought a long beat. "Leaving for a beginning and missing the home that's here," he answered honestly. "Fear you having to hear the rain alone." Her lips pressed lightly to hold back something rising. She adjusted the hat, showing him the 3 blue stitches. "You go to look," she said, each word clear, not to run, but to know what you're choosing to stay for. Before turning out the lights, Jake went to the porch post, touching the carved J, then E. The wood was warm from the lamp inside. No prayer, yet the gesture, carried its own message. Rain continued steady as a blacksmith's clock after a long day. Dawn broke as a gray streak beneath heavy clouds. The rain hadn't entirely stopped. A north wind cut sharply, lifting the smell of wet earth onto the porch. Jake donned his coat, slung the leather bag across his shoulder. Tempest was saddled, black mane, glistening deep eyes, unwavering. Buddy hopped up the steps twice, then paused, as if understanding he must stay to guard the home. Eliza stood by the porch post, dark scarf around her neck, hair damp with moisture. She handed Jake a wrapped portion of cornbread, a small bag of salt, and a pinch of dried mint. "For the night," she said when the fire runs low. Their hands lingered in the exchange longer than usual. In that touch, the wind paused for a heartbeat. He swung onto the saddle, his foot settling on the stirrup. Tempest shifted her weight, a smooth motion practiced through the seasons they had spent together. A small blue ribbon tied to the saddle knob quivered with the movement. Buddy ran a few steps, then stopped, letting out a short bark that seemed to say, "Understood." Jake pulled his hat down, brushing his hand along the brim where 3 tiny blue stitches were hidden, then turned the horse toward the dirt road leading to the ferry. He didn't look back immediately, for he knew if he did, the rain in his eyes would weigh heavier than the rain outside. Eliza stood on the porch, hands resting on a post. Only when Tempest's hooves had left a dark trail across the mud did she whisper, "Be safe." The wind carried her words away, chasing after the shrinking figure in the raincoat. The road to the ferry was dotted with countless puddles, each holding a fragment of the low-hanging sky. Tempest moved steadily, lifting her hooves, neatly, sending water splashing up to Jake's raincoat. Sagebrush bent aside, bowing, as if to greet the cowboy searching for answers within himself. At the second fork, Jake stopped, unwrapped a bite of the cornbread. Eliza had packed, chewed a small piece, and let the mint leaf cool his chest, a gentle opening for his heart. He pulled out the letter, reading it again. In the rain, the ink had blurred, but the words, "new community plots of land lottery," still stood firm, like stones blocking the stream. By midday, he reached the old plantation. The yard was flooded, yet dozens had gathered under the long porchmen in soaked coats, women cradling children, coughing elders, young men with cotton scarves wrapped around their necks. The smell of wet wool, simmering soup in iron pots, sweat and hope mingled together, warming the breath of those present. An official in a black robe called names, pointing to maps drawn in faded ink, riverside plots, numbered notes, reading good grass floods in rainy season, dike-needed cotton trees present. Jake stood close to a post eyes scanning each square. Each plot was both invitation and obligation. Build a dike, raise a house, divert the water, summon people. He imagined his hands on the hammer, on the stake, on the rope. Imagined cold nights, early dawns, the glow of an oil lamp on a porch that had no sign yet. And then, like a shadow cast over every vision, Eliza's face appeared amid the kitchen smoke, her calm eyes saying, "I'll watch the house," the thimble resting between salt and pepper, the blue ribbon trembling along the eastern fence, Buddy tapping his tail against the step in rhythm with Jake's stride. "Are you putting your name down?" Someone nudged him, eyes flickering like fire catching dry wood. Jake turned, half a smile, half the rain settling in his eyes. "I need a little more time," he said. He stepped back from the porch, letting the rain splash against him like a bucket of water thrown over his hesitation. Afternoon stretched on. He didn't draw a lot. He wandered along the riverbank until the campfire behind him blurred like fireflies in the rain. At a rising patch of land, he stopped sheltering under a cottonwood, sparking a small fire with a piece of dry wood tucked in his coat, a Western survival reflex. The flames flickered, the smoke stung his eyes, and in his mind he painted another picture, a porch, with E and J etched a pot of beans with less salt. Eliza laughing over not enough salt, the night air tinged with mint. He removed his hat, fingers tracing the 3 blue stitches inside 3 silent dots, holding the brim together. His fingers rested there steady. At the farm, Eliza worked for both of them, checking chickens, gathering eggs, straightening a shed door warped by rain. She brewed coffee, as every morning, setting a cup on the main doorway sill, a habit from the days Jake stayed home, then carried it to the kitchen to warm herself. Buddy followed her step-by-step eyes, waiting for command, occasionally dashing to the porch to glance across the field as if he could summon his master with thought alone. She touched the E on the post, then the J, feeling the wood warmer under her hand than any flame. On the eastern fence, the blue ribbon shimmered with raindrops intact, fluttering lower than usual. Night came. Eliza lit a lamp and hung it on the porch. Its thin glow pierced the rain enough for anyone passing in the dark to know the house was home. She settled into the wooden chair by the door thimble, resting in her palm. "Clear skies tomorrow," she whispered, borrowing his own words for the empty room. By the river, Jake added a stick to the small fire, repeating that phrase in his head, hearing it like a simple map pointing the right way. The rain eased. The wind shifted. On opposite banks, under the same sky, one held a lamp, the other held 3 stitches. And between them, a wet road was slowly drying enough for hooves tomorrow to find their path back home. Part 7. Renewal. Morning opened, with the scent of damp earth, rising like the breath of someone just waking. Mist hung low over the grass, clinging as sparkling droplets on the barbed wire fence like beads strung on a hidden thread. From the porch, the first sunlight crept in, brushing a thin yellow streak across the wooden post, carved with the letters E and J. The blue ribbon on the eastern fence was still wet from the rain, fluttering lightly like the chest of a sleeping child. Eliza rose at the second crow of the rooster. She wrapped a gray scarf around her neck, tucked her hair back, and slipped her mother's copper thimble into her dress pocket, a necessity like carrying flint in the West. Buddy waited on the doorstep, wagging his tail in measured rhythm. In the stable, Tempest sniffed, exhaling a cool breath, ears swiveling at the sound of Eliza's footsteps. The saddle leather still carried the scent of yesterday's oil mingled with straw that had shifted in the night's rain. In the chicken coop, a few chicks soaked through shivered from the lingering cold. Eliza spread a dry burlap sack over them, lifting each one gently and pressing it to her warm chest. She set a small pot of water over the charcoal fire, adding a few dried mint leaves. The rising steam smelled fresh and soothing. She tilted it slightly so the warmth drifted toward the nest. "Now, breathe in slowly," she murmured in the gentle voice of a woman tending a fevered child. Buddy nudged his nose, sniffed, then lay down as a warm, furry wedge at the stable door. Nearby, a newborn calf from last night wheezed. Eliza laid a wool blanket, wiped the sticky mucus from its nose, rubbing strongly along its sides to stimulate circulation. The mother stood close, stretching her nose to lick her calf eyes shining. "Come on now," Eliza whispered, placing her hand on its tiny chest, counting breaths as if counting stitches. The rapid rhythm gradually slowed. Outside, the sun seemed to breathe, along rising a little higher. She moved to the porch stove, kindling a fire with dried pine branches hidden under the roof. The wood crackled as it caught mingling with the aroma of coffee. Eliza poured a cup, setting it on the main house's windowsill, keeping the ritual of mornings when Jake was home. Then she carried it back to the kitchen, sipping. The gentle bitterness felt like the most ordinary greeting on a day made strange by the absence of someone. Puddles on the yard reflected the blue sky like shards of broken glass. Along the fence, the barbed wire dried, whispering faint vibrations each time the wind passed, a sound of work completed yet alive. Eliza slipped her hand through the stall bars, letting Tempest nuzzle her wrist. The horse snorted in acknowledgement, a wordless reply. On the porch, the wooden post warmed, holding the steady heartbeat of the day. Jake left the old plantation as the rain fell in fine threads like silk. Under his raincoat, the cornbread Eliza had wrapped crumbled, but the roasted corn still sweet and tender, the mint leaves cooling his throat like a small ice pack placed on a hot spot. He led Tempest through the puddles, hooves firm water, splashing against his boots. Along the way, he encountered families, struggling young mothers, clutching children, old men, pulling wooden carts, skinny boys leading lame donkeys. They spoke of riverbanks, cottonwood posts, to tie boats of wanting to call this place home, in the voice of someone standing on an invisible threshold. He stopped at a stuck wheel. Jumping down, he pushed with his shoulder, shouting once, and the cart lifted from the mud. A little girl on the wagon had a blue ribbon in her hair. She smiled, offering him a wrinkled apple. He declined, but the scent, autumn-old apple followed him for a while. Ahead lay a possible future building, levees planting grass, tending herds, opening water channels, raising porches, engraved with new letters. Yet each vision was overlaid by another, the copper thimble between salt and pepper, the empty hook by Eliza's coat, the fluttering ribbon after the rain, and the small hand sewing 3 blue stitches into the hat's brim, hidden inside like unspoken vows. He pulled down his hat, touching the 3 stitches. The rough feel against his fingers became a guidepost, not hiding, but choosing Eliza's words from last night echoed in his mind. Indeed, to choose is to face both sides. The new land calls, yet the home here calls him through small acts, a cup of coffee on the sill, a calf needing rubbing, a porch post still warm. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage from the hillside toward him. In the distance, black rails led to town like a streak of wind, yet his heart tugged the reins in the opposite direction. "Home," he said to Tempest. The horse flicked its ear, understanding. They turned toward a midday sky, peeling away clouds opening like a door without creaking hinges. At the third bend, Jake paused, plucked a sprig of sage and a dew-drenched blade of grass, tying them to the saddle horn, to carry the scent of the journey back to the porch, a reply letter for someone who never asked for one. As the roof appeared beyond the cottonwoods, the sun poured gold over the short grass. The blue ribbon on the eastern fence shimmered, as if sprinkled with silver dust. Smoke from the stove rose straight, signaling calm wind. Buddy heard hooves from afar, leaped from the porch, barked twice in joy, then ran in a looping celebration. Jake held Tempest before the calf's stall. He didn't call out, only watched through the open door's gap. Eliza squatted on the straw, the calf resting its head in her lap. She pressed her hand to its chest, counting, slowly blowing warm air through her fingers into its nose, adjusting its rhythm like tuning a fragile instrument. The mother nudged, gently inhaled a long breath, exhaled in reassurance. Nearby, the chicks had stopped trembling, fluffing under the dry burlap. Light filtering through the roof made their down sparkle around their necks, like captured sunset on skin. Jake stepped closer, kneeling beside Eliza, without startling the calf. He added a wool blanket to its back, placing his large hand over hers, locking a heartbeat together. Eliza's hand was small but steady. It carried the smell of kitchen smoke mint and wet grass, the scent of a home recently weathered by rain. The calf's breathing evened, eyes opening, licking lightly their hands. A quiet exhale passed from both, relief alike though, from separate chests. Eliza looked up. Their eyes met close enough to read the unspoken. He returned not out of fear of new land, but out of love for what was growing here. Outside, wind brushed the fence, producing a delicate note. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat, gazed toward the porch and the post carved with letters. He turned to Eliza, taking her hand, as he had taken her morning hand, but this time without rain, only the scent of new sun. "This is my home," he said. The words came low, slow, but firm enough that even the stable seemed to hear. Eliza pressed her lips together, eyes glistening. She didn't ask what he had seen on the plantation, didn't ask why he didn't draw lots. She placed her other palm over his, holding it, like pressing down a corner of paper to keep the wind from blowing it away. Tempest snorted outside. Buddy wagged his tail against the porch, keeping the beat. On the eastern fence, the blue ribbon swayed gently, bowing to a decision finally named. The midday heat rose dampness, mingling with the smell of stewed beans and sun-dried saddle leather. Jake hung his raincoat on his hook. Eliza returned the gray scarf to its hook, the empty hook of long familiarity, worn smooth around the nail. They ate a simple lunch, cornbread, beans, coffee, silent, like listening to music, without needing to parse each note. Afterwards, Jake retrieved the rain-stained envelope from his coat pocket, placing it on the old tin plate on the porch. Eliza said nothing. He struck a match. Flames caught. The words resettlement curled, blackened, then turned to ash. A gentle breeze scattered the fine ashes onto the porch, mingling with ashes of letters Eliza had written but never sent. "For what has been said," she whispered. Jake nodded. They leaned forward together, each using 2 fingers to scatter ashes evenly at the post marked E and J, a private ritual, a marker for a new season. Jake took the sprig of sage he had tied to the saddle horn and hung it on a small nail under the eave. The warm scent of sage-like laughter after illness. Eliza opened the wooden box on the shelf, placing the thimble neatly between salt and pepper, touching lightly to balance it. A breeze stirred the paper, labeled May. "Fix. Keep shaking it gently." Those 3 words were like a bridge over a river flowing from I to we. In the afternoon, they went together, to check the fence after the rain. The wires were taut, the posts firmed the blue ribbon drying. Jake carved a small mark into the porch post, a short line like Part 8. The final challenge. The afternoon was as clear as a freshly polished bronze bell. The sky hung still deep blue, while sunlight spilled over the roof's edge, making dust particles float in the barn like tiny seeds of new grass. A crisp breeze slid across the porch, brushing the E and J carved into the post, then trailing down the nape of the neck in a cooling sigh. Along the eastern fence, the blue ribbon had dried completely, fluttering with a steady rhythm, like the breath of someone recovering from a fever. On the yard, the soft tap of spurs on the wooden steps marked Jake's passage. The smell of sun-warmed leather from the saddle mixed with the sage scent Eliza had hung under the eaves the day before, filling the air with a clean, cozy fragrance of home. Eliza spread a cloth across the workbench and poured out a bag of needles and thread to sort after days of rain. Coils of white linen, black thread, a few bent needles that had stitched saddles, a shiny copper thimble she touched out of habit. When she lifted the bag, her fingers caught on an unfamiliar seam, a second lining she didn't remember sewing. She picked up the scissors and cut lightly. Inside, bits of cotton spilled out, along with a small, cold object the size of a fingertip. An old silver chain, the pendant in the shape of a teardrop, tarnished with age. In the center, a faint impression of a flower that had never fully bloomed. Eliza sank into the chair, her heart skipping a beat. She rubbed the surface gently with a cloth. The gray dust gave way to an old engraving, two slender, intertwined letters. M.T., her mother's name, Martha Turner. Inhaling, she smelled the cheap soap of long ago, heard the scissors slicing fabric across a narrow wooden table, heard her mother's voice. "Don't cut too hard, you'll tear it more." The old kitchen, the little window, looking out onto the yard, her mother's shadow cast on the whitewashed wall. All rushed back at once, like a herd of horses breaking loose. She remembered the night she left home. Her mother had shoved something hurriedly into her sewing bag, hands trembling, speaking only a broken sentence. "When you find a place to call home, then open it." Eliza had forgotten. Not because she wanted to, but because life had chased her with relentless urgency. Today, in the clear afternoon and the sharp breeze, the necklace felt like an eye-opening to memories long bandaged. She placed it in her palm. The cold metal made her skin shiver a shiver, like stepping onto the familiar porch after a long journey. Jake stepped past the barn door, the gun belt brushing leather with a dry sound, the rifle resting on his thigh, like a silent Western ritual. He stopped when he saw Eliza sitting still, eyes fixed on the pale silver in her hands. "What's that?" he asked softly, lifting his hat so the sun wouldn't blind him. Eliza didn't answer immediately. She closed her hand around it, then opened it again as if training her heart to accept this new motion. The old necklace rested there, small as a period, yet carrying an unspoken story that stretched longer than any sentence could. Some afternoons, silence speaks louder than words. Eliza laid the necklace on the cloth, exhaled slowly, letting her breath sink to her palm. "It's my mother's," she said, her voice like stepping through a door. "I thought I'd lost it the night I left. Turns out she hid it." and I only open it now." She smiled, the corners of her mouth trembling. The tremble half from the cold wind, half from a delicate chain bridging two distant shores of time. She wiped the pendant with a scrap of cloth moistened with warm water. Each pass revealed the engraving more clearly, as if a voice from afar drew closer. M.T. Martha Turner. Suddenly, the 16-year-old knights rushed back, wind whistling through the porch spurs, clinking from drunken men in the saloon, Eliza's arms clutching her sewing bag as she hurried through the alley to avoid jeering men. And then her mother's hand, bony warm, placing something hurriedly into her bag, lips whispering, "When you find a home, open it." Her unfinished words traveled deeper and farther with her daughter than any full sentence ever could. Eliza closed her eyes, listening to her own breath mingle with tempests clattering in the stable, the ropes brushing the porch, the distant hammer echoing from some far-off ranch. She opened her eyes to the barn workbench nail racks, grain bins taped twice over. To the porch, E and J carved in the post. To Jake, sun-dried sweat, forming a thin crust on his brow, boot nails smeared with forest mud. All of it combined into a simple painting with a name she had once feared to speak home. But naming it was one thing. Believing she had the right to call it, that was another. Eliza's hand trembled a little more this time, from old fears resurfacing. "If I keep this," she whispered, "am I leaving someone behind?" The question wasn't just for her mother. It was for herself, the woman who had learned to live by needle and thread, mending the rips of others while leaving her own scars untouched. Jake didn't rush an answer. He pulled up a chair, sitting slightly lower, so the necklace met Eliza's eyes. "Some things you keep to remember," he said slowly, "and some things you keep to know you're allowed to move forward." He offered his handkerchief. "The path doesn't make you leave anyone," he added, "it just asks you to choose a direction." Out here in the West, words like that were usually heard under saloon lights beside a gun laid lightly on the bar. Here, Jake's hand rested near a wooden ruler and wire cutters, the tools of a man who chose to protect by repairing. Eliza nodded. She lifted the necklace, its weight enough to remind her it was real. "I want to place it on the table," she said, "because from here, everything moves forward." The wind brushed the porch, leaving a small patch of cool on the wood. And because of that cool patch, because Jake didn't push or pull, because Tempest's breathing was steady, Eliza felt ready to do what she had avoided for years, lay an old life, condensed into a silver chain, onto the table of a new home. The sun crawled slowly, pouring gold nearly to the steps. Eliza placed the necklace on the workbench, right beside the copper thimble, standing amid salt and pepper. Her gesture no longer trembled. It was as deliberate and gentle as setting a pot on the stove each morning. She looked at Jake, her eyes neither pleading nor explaining, only inviting him to witness the moment unfold in its own time. "This is what's left of my family." The words carried no blame, no claim, no price. They were like writing a name on the cover of a book, to remember not to boast. Jake looked at the necklace a moment longer than usual. He remembered the blue ribbon in the wooden box, the tiny pair of wool socks never worn. Remembered that afternoon in the loft when Eliza had said, "Take it along so you don't get lost on a good day." His hand reached out slowly, touching the silver. Metal cooled a little under his skin. He met her gaze. You're not alone anymore. The two statements rested side by side on the table like nails driven into perfect holes. The wind softened into a caress. Buddy, sleeping under the table, twitching his ears, sighed as if hearing both voices finally find their harmony. Jake pulled the wooden box closer, taking out the small lemon oil bottle he still used for cleaning gun stocks and saddles. "Let's make it shine a little," he said, pouring some onto a rag and rubbing the pendant in circular motions. Under his hands, the silver lost its grayness, revealing the warmth of metal that had spent years close to human skin. Eliza took small pliers to straighten a bent clasp. Each motion was like a stitch pick pass, tighten release, not showy, but precise. "The back of the pendant is smooth," Jake said quietly, turning it to her. "If you want, you could engrave 2 letters. He handed her a small knife, the kind he used to shave fence posts, its tip glinting in a thin line. Eliza glanced briefly, then nodded. "Not to erase the old," she said, "but so the old has its place beside the new." Jake carved slowly, the knife tip sinking into the silver, the soft scritch like rain far away. When he lifted it, 2 slender letters appeared on the back. EJ. Eliza traced both sets of letters with her fingertips. MT on the front, EJ on the back, the sensation like touching 2 shores of a bridge. She exhaled, not the breath of surrender, but the breath of someone untangling a knot tied too long ago. In the afternoon, the wind suddenly carried into the yard the clinking tinkle of a traveling merchant's bell. A peddler stopped at the gate, calling out in an Eastern accent. Knives sharpened new combs and mirrors, holy images, silver chains, letters to Elkhorn Bozeman, Cheyenne. The word Elkhorn hit Eliza's ears like a pebble dropped into a still lake. Jake looked at her. Eliza paused, then gave a slight nod. They went out onto the porch. The peddler tipped his hat. "Any letters?" He held out a canvas mail bag in one hand, a bundle of wooden combs in the other. Eliza looked at the bag, as if gazing into a deep well. "How long has it been since you went east?" she asked. "Every 2 months," he replied. "Elkhorn's digging a new well, fixing the market roofs, repainting the church. Lots of new people. Old ones, seldom seen." His words were as matter-of-fact as cold water. Eliza turned back, inside, opened a wooden box, took out paper, ink, and pen. She sat at the table where the necklace gleamed, writing briefly. "Father," she still wrote, that though unsure who would read it, "I am well. If you still need to know, I've found a place to breathe. If not, the wind will know." She did not elaborate, no excuses. She folded it into quarters, tied it with a leftover linen thread from that morning's stitching. The peddler accepted it, placing it in his bag. "Would you like a holy picture?" he offered, shaking a stack of cheaply printed images. Eliza shook her head, smiling. "At my home. There's already writing." When he left, the bell's clink faded into the distance, leaving the scent of polished silver behind. Jake turned to see Eliza still standing by the table, her hand on the necklace. Was it wrong? She asked to carve EJ into MT's back. Jake smiled the smile he reserved for questions that touched the softest part of the chest. "No," he said, like carving the rainy days after the sunny ones. "No one demands the sky choose." He took a thin leather cord, threaded it through the necklace, and handed it to Eliza. She put it on. The necklace rested in the hollow of her neck, where her mother had once placed her hand when she had a fever. The wind passed through, The silver touched her cool skin, then warmed quickly. "It listens to my heart," Eliza whispered. "It knows the way to stay." She turned to Jake. "If one day I forget, remind me where this is." Jake nodded in the center. He not only meant the spot on her neck, but the place this object occupied in their story at the center, like a central beam. The sun hung on the hillside, dripping the last red drops. The chill returned. The scent of morning grass and damp earth had become the smell of afternoon sun-dried hay. Eliza reached for her grandmother's locket, the one she always carried, with a small fabric covering the pin, placing it beside her mother's necklace. "One for the old home, one for the new." She said, "I'll hang hers on the porch post, so anyone coming in will be greeted. Mine I'll wear." She paused, lightly touching the hollow of her neck. To remember the way, Jake took a thin, thorny cord, tied her grandmother's locket to a small nail under the eave, right next to the sprig of sage. It barely swung in the wind, like a bell that doesn't ring, but still makes a sound. Eliza stood opposite, touching the E and J carved into the post, 2 letters, now accompanied by 2 silver pieces, like invisible witnesses to the flow of people coming and going. Tempest nickered softly in the stable. Buddy stretched lazily as if confirming the new order, each object in its place, each person in theirs. Jake returned to the table, took a knife, and carved onto a thin piece of wood the letters MSG. The 3 initials Eliza had once written on a scrap of paper. May. Repair, keep. He added a vertical notch at the beginning, their private mark, like a hammer strike on a fence post. He placed the wood on the shelf right above the brass thimble. "For your craft," he said, "and for the way we live." Eliza watched, smiling, though tears ran warm streaks down her face. The wind carried scents from the distant town, the clinking of iron, the banjo in some saloon, the loud laughter of strangers. Here the sounds they heard were gentle cords brushing lightly, chicks scratching straw, the calf swung my, chewing the soft pop of an oil lamp like corn kernels. They stood on the porch, looking toward the eastern fence. The blue ribbon caught the sunset light, forming a dark streak like a vein along a wrist, carrying the meadow's lifeblood home. Eliza placed her hand on Jake's, this new habit requiring no permission. "Last time she said you left and said you wouldn't forget me. Today, I'm here to say I no longer have to remember alone." She smiled, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Jake tilted his head, letting his hat touch her hair, the other hand on the necklace in the hollow of her neck warm. "Yes," he replied, his voice like stamping a seal on a document that had been thoroughly read. "And if strong winds come, we'll stitch another seam." They went into the kitchen as darkness stretched across the fields. Dinner was a pot of soup, salted just right, slightly less than perfect. Eliza took out her thimble, mending the torn edge of the tablecloth. Jake sat across, sharpening a small knife. Its blade caught the light quietly, like freshly polished silver. On the porch, her grandmother's locket swayed slightly. Her mother's necklace rested at her daughter's hollow E, and Jay stood still. MSG. Hung on the shelf, the blue ribbon held its place on the fence. All like stitches beginning to close a large tier, the tier of years when people lived at opposite ends. As the lights dimmed, only the porch lantern remained. Eliza paused at the threshold, looking back. Their shadows fell parallel on the wooden floor. She touched the necklace like touching her mother's hand along one more stretch, then the porch post like touching the hand of the man who would walk the rest of the way. Night fell gently, like a thick blanket. Outside, the chill wind was no longer cold. It only made one remember to pull the blanket higher. Inside the house, 2 hooks were in their familiar places. A thimble stood between salt and pepper, a piece of wood carved MSG, and between their chests, a new sentence lit itself when needed: I am no longer alone. 9. Finding acceptance. The sky poured fire as if someone had emptied an entire can of red paint over the hill's edge, the evening light spreading into bands of dark bronze. The lingering dampness from an earlier rain rose gently, mingling with the smell of sun-dried straw and warm pine resin. The wire fence quivered lightly whenever the wind brushed past, humming a thin note like a perfectly tuned string. On the eastern fence, the blue ribbon had dried, fluttering in steady rhythm, a sign of a home that could breathe. On the porch, the wooden post carved with E and J glowed honey-colored. The copper thimble nestled among salt and pepper shimmered in the last light. A small piece of wood marked MSG stood neatly on the shelf like a gentle reminder: May, mend, keep. Eliza folded the wool blanket, hanging it on the line beneath the eaves. Her mother's necklace rested in the hollow of her neck, the silver warmed by her skin. She stepped across the yard, tapping the wooden trough in rhythm to signal meal time. The calf dawn mist shook her head, sneezed once, as if nodding to her new life, then nestled against her mother's side, greedily drinking milk, tinged with the scent of fresh grass. Buddy lay stretched across the steps, ears pricked at the faint thump of the corn pounder from the house across the hill. He sniffed, reassured that order on the farm remained, as always, perfectly aligned like a hat sewn together at every joint. Jake emerged from the stable wide-brimmed hat, shading his face from the slanting sun. The spurs on his boots clicked softly on the wooden steps. He had just oiled the old saddle. The leather gleamed, the scent of lemon oil blending with the aged leather into a smell only those familiar with the West would recognize, half storm, half peace. He shook the reins, hung them on a hook. Tempest tossed her mane, snorted sharply in habit, as if greeting her master, then nudged her nose into Eliza's forearm, her heartbeat strong and stubborn like her own. They said little. Eliza checked how much corn remained in the basket. Jake walked along the fence, tugging a few latches, packing earth around slightly protruding post bases. When he returned, Eliza had lit the stove, a pot of beans, hissing the faint aroma of mint, lifting the corner of the kitchen. These small, repeated tasks, wedging doors, checking stores, drawing the curtain, turning the oil lamp, made the house swell with a quiet beauty so simple it caught one off guard. Tomorrow, we'll fix the other half of the ditch, Eliza said, brushing a streak of cornmeal on the table as if drawing a path. Yeah, Jake replied. I'll do the lower part tomorrow. He smiled, echoing a promise they had once made while watching the geese change formation. It was his turn to shield the wind from behind. From afar, a train whistle stretched a metallic breath. Once it had suggested departure. Now it sounded like a greeting, a reminder that one had the right to stand still. A cold wind brushed Eliza's collar. Jake lifted her scarf higher, his fingers gliding over the silver at her neck. In that moment, there was no thunder or crash only a quiet yes inside them, like nodding to oneself, we are still here, and that is right. By midday, they had gone into town for salt-bought fabric and sent a plow blade for sharpening. Now, those images chased each other like slow-motion film. Duffy's general store smelled faintly of roasted coffee. The worn wooden floor gleamed from hundreds of booted footsteps. Spurs clicked across the saloon floor, across the street, sometimes accompanied by scattered words. Today, eyes that once cut like knives when looking at Eliza had softened. "You sew very well, Mrs. Abernathy," the blacksmith's wife said, handing Eliza a worn coat. "The hems, like you gave it birth." She spoke haltingly, a pin in her mouth, but her eyes were soft. Eliza smiled, borrowed the table, rotated the coat, measured, counting the rhythm of stitches in her head. Her mother's necklace nestled inside the collar, silver glinting like a new crescent moon, and strangely no longer something she wanted to hide. At the counter, Mr. Duffy flipped through the debt ledger, looked up. "Morrison, you paid on time last round. That rumor about you moving wasn't true, huh?" Jake tipped his hat, replying just enough. "Our home is to the east." The words slipped softly, like rains gliding. Duffy paused, then smiled, the kind of man who understood that such confirmation was more reliable than ink in a ledger. Outside the hardware store, blacksmith Cole, once scowling at Eliza, set down his hammer, stroked his beard. "This peddlehead knows the long road. Who would think to win so skillfully?" Jake didn't look at Eliza, yet his hand found a subtle gesture only the familiar would notice, tapping 2 fingers lightly on his hat brim, a quiet pride. "Family wins," he said. "Family." The word wrapped around Eliza like a blanket on a windy night. In the saloon, the banjo jumped and flickered. A few voices shouting, "Hey Morrison, heard there's good land by the river, aren't you tempted?" Jake placed the bag of salt in the saddle pouch, leisurely. "I'm already standing on the best spot." Slow and certain enough to turn whistles into clearing throats. A drunken man tried to joke about the girl you picked up, but blacksmith Cole shook his head, nudged him. "Talk about horses, yes. About someone else's home, shut up and drink." In the West, switching sides rarely caused a fuss, just a nod a hand on the shoulder at the right time. As they turned their horses toward the farm, the last sunlight fell thin as silk. Eliza rode behind arms around the bundle of fabric chin, lightly resting on Jake's leather-clad shoulder. The familiar path wound through minty fields, wine mingling the smell of horse sweat with dried mint hanging under the eaves. At the third turn, Eliza tugged his jacket slightly toward herself. No reason other than to make sure the man ahead was still truly there. "Yeah," Jake murmured softly, as if answering a question she hadn't asked yet. Before dusk fully fell, Jake led Eliza to the hill behind the house, soft soil patches of mint in small clumps where he had laid down 3 tiny lives, and then stood for years, never daring to name them. The wind there usually wailed like a train whistle lost in the desert, but this afternoon it was gentle brushing collars like a mother's hand. Jake stopped before 2 low parallel stones pulled up small tufts of budding weeds. He didn't kneel immediately. He placed his hand on Eliza's shoulder, a momentary request through touch. "This is the place." His voice stumbled like a wagon hitting a stone in the mud. Eliza nodded softly. "I know." She removed her gray scarf, tore a small strip, braided it with a sprig of mint, and tied it to the wooden stake near the grave. "For the one who taught you to eat bland, to appreciate bread," she said, lips curved with a watery smile. "And for the little one who taught you to love slowly, to love well." Jake knelt, knees pressing into damp earth hat on his chest. "Hannah." He spoke the name of his late wife here for the first time, without a throat constricted by thorns. "I'm home." He exhaled, glancing at Eliza. "This is Eliza, the one who sews, mends, keeps the house upright. No one replaces anyone. But if you allow the word peace, now carries her voice." He bowed his head. The soil received the words like it was drinking the last drops of rain after a drought. Eliza didn't interrupt. She stood beside him, hands clasped before her stomach, the cool necklace against her skin. When Jake fell silent, she spoke to the wind, as if to a woman sitting on the old porch. "Hannah, if anything's needed, remind me in the wind. I'm not good with words, but my needle goes straight. I will stitch the scarf edges tight, repair the raincoat hem, sew the edges of sleepless nights. I'll leave the porch light less salt in the pot, so he recognizes the smell of home without mistake." She bowed her head, not pleading for what once belonged to another, only asking to preserve the warmth that remained. A wild hint of mint drifted across the hill, brushing their cheeks like a gentle touch. Jake picked up a small stone, scraped off the mud, and placed it beside two older stones. "For today," he said. Eliza added a sprig of thyme tied with the gray ribbon for tomorrow. They stood still for a moment, listening to the sky change above. The things that once locked hearts no longer raged. They simply sat down, yielding the way old horses do when the foals run past the fence. The sky darkened as they returned home. Red light poured onto the steps, and then withdrew, leaving a thin orange streak like a smiling mouth. Jake built a fire outside a small blaze just warm enough for their hands and placed a birch stick on the workbench. He grabbed a piece of heated iron, held it in the flames until its tip glowed deep red like a heart under pressure. Eliza sat nearby, preparing a bowl of water to quench it, her hands holding the wood. Buddy lay between them like a soft lock. "What shall we mark?" Eliza asked. "Not mark." Jake chuckled, stamp. He pulled from the box a simple mold he had shaped, intertwined letters E and J with a small curve at the base like the rhythm of the wind. "For the calves to come," he said, "and for everything we touch. To know the way back if something's lost." Eliza nodded. The red-hot iron met the wood sizzle. Sweet-smelling smoke rose, resinous and sugary. The EJ imprint appeared glossy black, the curve at its foot like a gust of wind across the meadow. Jake dipped the iron into the water again. Sizzle, and the steam drew a thin mist between them. Eliza traced the mark with her fingers, feeling lingering warmth as if sensing the heartbeat of the home beneath her skin. "Hang it here," Jake asked, lifting the wooden plank to chest height. "On the porch, under the thimble," Eliza replied. "Let it smell salt, pepper, and home-cooked meals." They used two small nails to fasten the wood to the post under MSG. From the plank, a thin wisp of smoke still danced. At the edge of the porch, her grandmother's locket gently vibrated, reflecting the firelight as tiny moving sparks, like fireflies, reluctant to sleep. Eliza brought out a pot of beans, ladling a bowl, for each sprinkling a pinch of pepper. They sat on the steps, eating slowly, the spoons tapping the bowls with a soft tick-tick. In the distance, a slightly out-of-tune banjo in the saloon played a few whimsical notes, carried thin by the evening breeze, until it became merely a hint. Jake set his bowl down and reached out. Eliza placed her hand in his without a word. He tugged gently. They rose, stepping back, allowing her other hand to rest on his shoulder. On the western porch, they glided in a silent dance. No music, only the rhythm of the shaking fence and the crackling fire. Boot heels tapped the wooden floor with a delicate tack-tack, like marking the end of every sentence. When they stopped, they laughed together, not loudly, but with eyes misting. Jake brushed the brim of his hat against Eliza's forehead, a fleeting touch like wind, then stepped back half a pace to see her full face in the fading red light. He didn't say thank you, but his hand curved as if holding an invisible rein loose. Now the horse trusted the road ahead, no longer steep as memory once drew it. Late afternoon had become the boundary between light and dark. The crimson sky faded into deep violet, like a velvet swath draping the fields. Crickets sang, late birds sought their roosts, leaving scattered notes. The oil lamp on the porch flared. Eliza always lit it as darkness touched the threshold, a greeting for any wayfarers. The blue ribbon on the eastern fence swayed quietly, like a hand resting briefly on a fevered forehead, checking if the heat had subsided. Jake and Eliza stood side by side at the edge of the porch eyes on the darkening field. A gentle breeze carried the scent of distant river water into the yard, gliding across their clothes, slipping into soft folds of memory and leaving no scratch. Their shadows stretched long, brushing the grass. Tempest shifted in the stall, inhaling deeply, exhaling a hint of imaginary brass parades. Buddy changed sides, resting his head on Jake's boot like a tether binding 3 lives. You know, Eliza whispered, barely louder than rustling leaves. I used to think healing came only through grand things. Long promises, great journeys. Turns out, it's because you remind me to pull my scarf when the wind blows, because you eat beans with little salt without frowning because of the extra peg you hammered for me. And she touched her necklace, because you stamped EJ on MT without fear of mistakes. Jake tilted his head, his eyes holding the lamp's glow in her eyes like guarding a hearth fire from the wind. I thought only hammer and fence could fix a house, he said, his voice a new layer of wood. Never guessed a green stitch inside a hatband could hold a whole season. Eliza rested her head on Jake's shoulder. His leather jacket carried the scent of long roads now stayed. She closed her eyes, letting her weight lean, fully trust. Rarely takes such a clear shape. Can we start over? The question slipped out, like a worn key finally fitting the lock. It didn't tremble. It was simply real. Jake didn't answer immediately. He turned to face her, the lamp lighting her cheek, revealing eyes that had learned to see life without hiding. Then he smiled, the fewest words, yet the richest meaning the West offers those who wait, lifting her chin gently to meet his gaze. It's just the beginning. The wind paused as if applauding. On the shelf, the copper thimble still stood between salt and pepper, between what must be seasoned and what remains as is. The EJ plank, beneath MSG, absorbed the smoke, promising a sweeter scent tomorrow. Her grandmother's locket swung lightly under the eaves, bowing to a new ritual. 2 people calling each other by name, trusting the other will stay when the sky changes. From afar, A train whistle cut a long, indifferent note, precise. On the porch, the two hooks stood accustomed to the day Eliza's coat, touching Jake's fabric edges, knowing each other. In the stall, Morning Mist burped. The mare answered with a calm nicker. Buddy breathed deeply. Tempest rubbed the latch with its muzzle goodnight whispers in horse language. Eliza opened her eyes, looking across the field. Darkness had draped itself, but not devoured, because here a lamp hung ready, a porch post knew their names. A hand was there to hold. She held Jake's hand, not letting go, needing no ritual. In that hand was the warmth of fire, the scent of leather, the sheen of labor, 3 secret green stitches. Ahead, where their shadows merged with the night, lay a path wide enough for 2 people, a horse and a dog to walk side by side. No pushing, no crowding. The first step of something begun long ago, but only now, named rightly. Part 10. The wedding. The air was crisp, like a cool hand, placed on the forehead, and the field in front of the house was lightly dusted with fallen birch leaves. Morning mist stretched across the eastern fence, the blue ribbon swaying gently, carrying a sense of calm. On the porch, the wooden post carved with E and J had darkened to a honey hue. Beneath the board, marked MSG, a copper thimble stood between salt and pepper, 3 words may, mend, keep like a secret code for the wedding day. Eliza opened the storage, cradling a bundle of white linen gifted by Mrs. Abernathy. The thimble rolled once over her fingertip. Needle-pierced thread ran straight the soft rustle of thread, like someone silently reading their vows to themselves. She dabbed her hand in chalk, marking the seams, wrist, and hem of the dress. Her mother's necklace, with a silver pendant, engraved MT on the front, and EJ on the back, lay warmly in the hollow of her neck, glimmering like a private star hidden beneath thin clouds. Jake set up a saw bench near the barn, carving a piece of birch into a small sign, East Porch Wedding. The scent of fresh wood, mingled with the sage Eliza had tied under the eaves, fragrant like a humble invitation. He lit a small iron stove and heated the EJ stamp to press into the sign. It hissed, releasing a sweet-smelling smoke, the curves at the base of the letters like the wind racing across the meadow. He hung the sign beneath the thimble, stepped back, and looked at the porch steps as one would a loved one in their new clothes. Buddy woke Morning Dew with a lick to the nose. The foal sneezed, shook its head, dropping a few golden leaves from its soft horns. Tempest had been bathed in warm water the night before. His mane was brushed smooth, the scent of saddle leather and lemon oil still sweet. Jake braided a thin leather strap for his mane, tucking in a sprig of sage. The horse snorted, accepting his wedding attire in his own way. In the distance, the train whistle carried a metallic note, recalling past departures. Today, the same sound became a signal to arrive like a bell, marking the start of a journey's destination. Eliza stretched a piece of cloth into a porch curtain and asked Cole the blacksmith to engrave 3 small words on a brass plate piece here. Cole filed the here slightly longer, as if to sink the letters deep into the metal. Duffy the grocer delivered a sack of freshly roasted coffee, casually saying, "To warm the guests' hands." The women from the church gathered golden leaves, laying them along the path like a silk carpet across the field. Before lunch, Jake brought his hat to the porch, touching the 3 green stitches on the inside of the brim. 3 stitches Eliza had sewn the day he went to the ferry. still intact?" he whispered. Eliza felt it, not with her ears, but with her back, leaning against the E and J post. The north wind blew sharp, yet not cold enough to pull a scarf a notch higher and smile at the brief shiver it brought to memory. By early afternoon, horse shadows flickered along the dirt road. Visitors came from town and distant farms. Mrs. Abernathy carried thick-crusted bread, Mr. Duffy a coffee pot, Cole a small wooden box. Children pinned blue ribbons to their collars, clutching bundles of dried birch leaves. The preacher, an elderly man with silver hair, rode a chestnut horse, his black robe flowing like a gentle crow, stopping at the gate, tipping his hat, eyes bright as embers in the wind. "God has granted a beautiful day," he said, his voice seasoned with more weddings than any judge in these parts. From the saloon came a harmonica player, the bar owner's freckled, shy son, standing in a corner of the porch, trying a few notes, the silver tones ringing like stream water breaking over rocks. Some brought chairs, others pushed hay bales into rows. More sage blue ribbons and Eliza's grandmother's locket hung under the eaves, lightly swinging in the breeze, the silent chime marking the wait. Cole opened the wooden box, handing Jake 2 rings forged from horseshoes, polished until they mirrored the autumn sky. "I made these from Tempest's hoof that fell last July," Cole said, fingers brushing his thick beard, "to mark the long road while still staying put." Jake took them, feeling the cold metal warm instantly in his hands, not just from heat, but from every action that shaped it, heating, hammering, filing like crafting a home. Eliza stepped from the front door onto the porch. Her simple white linen dress fit snugly at the shoulders, the collar stitched with tiny, careful threads, hem edged with meticulous hands. Her mother's necklace shone gently in her collar. Her hair neatly pinned a sprig of sage replacing a hairpin. Eyes that once pricked now softened. Mrs. Abernathy let out a joyful gasp. Mr. Duffy smiled freely, eyes crinkling. A young woman whispered to her daughter, "Look, this is how someone stands beautifully without gold." Jake approached wide-brimmed hat, in hand boots dusted clean, as if freshly entered from a church. Spurs clicked lightly against the wood, a signal of significance. He stood beside Eliza, not too close, not too far, just enough for hands to find each other, without awkwardness. The preacher placed the well-worn Bible on the table, glanced at the E and J post, nodding to himself, as if understanding that no many words were needed for those standing before him. "We gather here," the preacher said, voice, like long-kindled coals, revived. He opened the book, but did not read immediately. He looked to the golden leaf field, the blue ribbon to the east, the small EJ board under MSG. "This land is harsh," he said, "so people build strong fences. But fences aren't for locking each other in. They show the wind the way, guide the cattle home, and remind the heart where peace lies." The men nodded as if agreeing with a fence builder's truth. The preacher turned to Jake. "Son, speak in your own way." Jake lifted his hat-roughened hand on his chest. Words never came easily, never had, but today they flowed unimpeded. "Eliza," he began, voice deep and heavy as old wood, "I once thought a home was where nails drive straight. Now I know home starts with someone reminding you to pull your scarf when the wind bites. I can't promise sunshine year-round. I only promise, when the rain falls, I'll stand on the windy side. And if my hand slips on the nail, I'll learn to fix it." He extended the ring. The simple silver shone a cold glint that warmed instantly against her skin. Eliza placed her palm over his. The stitches she once made seemed to run anew through her veins. "Jake," she said, voice soft as linen yet strong, "I came here with thread thimble and worn-out things. I thought I only knew how to mend others' clothes, not my own. Turns out, someone who knows how to fix fences teaches me to keep the hearth. I can't promise a home always full of salt you like food mild." A few warm laughs rippled across the porch. "I only promise when the wind reminds me I'll add another stitch." The preacher nodded, closing the book. "Before God, before the scent of sage, before the blue ribbon, before the horse who understands more than a few men." He glanced at Tempest. Everyone laughed. "I declare these two husband and wife. Whoever passes by this porch will see this light. That is witness enough." The harmonica played a long note. The little girl scattered leaves on the steps. Buddy barked excitedly, then lay still, as if recalling the ritual. Jake slid the ring onto Eliza's finger. The Tempest hoof metal, both round in promise and square in action. Eliza placed the ring on Jake. It paused at his knuckle, before passing like a note through a breeze. They bowed their heads, foreheads touching, no lips needed. Behind them, the copper thimble gleamed among salt and pepper, nodding silently with the preacher to an unspoken "Amen" everyone could hear. After the declaration, the house became a feast. Eliza's pot of beans steamed on the table. Mrs. Abernathy cut crusty bread. Duffy poured dark coffee, the roasted aroma wrapping the chill. Cole sat a step lower, gently removing his leather gloves, eating as if he'd switched sides, the side of quiet joy. The harmonica played Red River Valley. A boy tapped spoons on cups to keep the beat. On the golden leaf carpet, children ran in circles, blue ribbons fluttering like young grass in the wind. Someone brought apple cider. Jake took a sip. Eliza smiled, shaking her head. "I've held the needle steady." Mrs. Abernathy offered a small piece of cake. "Eat to remember that sweetness isn't a sin." Tempest stood outside the stable, its neck loosely tied to the latch mane, scented with liniment. The children stroked its neck. It lowered its head, exhaling warm clouds. Buddy patrolled the steps like a sheriff finally resting his head on Jake's hat, the spurs clicking softly with every step across the porch. Jake reached out his hand, and Eliza placed hers in his. They took a turn around the porch together. The heels of their boots tapped the wood in a rhythmic pattern. The white linen skirt brushed over the leather jacket. They spun unhurried, revealing an old but new kind of two-person dance. Preacher pounded his hand on his knee to the beat, and Mr. Duffy let out a deep hoe from the gut as Jake spun Eliza smoothly, like winding a rope when catching a calf. Eliza laughed a soft, unsharpened laugh that made everyone want to breathe deeper. On the shelf, the EJ board, under MSG, absorbed the scent of roasted smoke, saturated with the aroma of the kitchen. Her grandmother's locket clinked lightly on its chain like a bell in a country church. When the music softened, Eliza carried out the second pot of soup, and Jake scooped it for everyone. "A little less salt," he said, eyes sparkling. "A little less salt," she replied, "but more heart." The whole porch let out a low, warm ha, heavy, as woodlight as wind. Sunset slid down the hill. Laughter, the clatter of spoons and bowls, the harmonica's tune, all layered into a thick warmth. Those who had once watched a trial collapse in the horse stable now witnessed two people mending broken pieces with nails and thread, with breath and bowls of beans. No speeches were given, yet agreement stood firm on the porch, like a fence stretched taut with sturdy ropes. As night fell, like a violet velvet guests slowly began leading their horses away. Reins snapped, click spurs, tap tap on the steps. Preacher, hat in hand, placed a hand on Jake and Eliza's shoulders. Porch lights on schedule, keep it so. He rode off cloak, swallowed by the darkness, like a bird returning to its nest. Mrs. Abernathy hugged Eliza, letting her emotion show for the first time. Duffy shook Jake's hand, a long, firm shake like driving a nail into a new post. Cole stayed behind, slipping a bent horseshoe nail into Jake's hand. Hang your mother's MT locket on its own post. A separate post is a sign of respect. The new house must have it. The yard emptied. Yellow leaves fell, covering the heaviest footprints. The harmonica faded, leaving only crickets and the soft clink of the locket under the eaves whenever the wind passed. Eliza gathered the bowls. Jake snuffed the fire buddy, retrieved a forgotten leather glove, placing it on the chair like a ritual. Together, they hung Cole's hook on the left porch post just below MSG. Eliza lifted her mother's locket for a moment, kissed its engraved silver, then hung it. EJ leaned lightly against the wood, two sides touching warm. When the door clicked shut outside the stable, Tempest stood still, head turned toward the porch. It inhaled deeply, exhaling long, a low, wide breath, like a saddle relaxing after a journey, like the meadow exhaling after a storm. That breath traveled across the yard, brushed the steps, lightly rattled the window pane, marking the day with a quiet done. Jake paused at the latch, turning his eyes soft to the rhythm of the horse's breath. He stepped forward, placing his hand on Tempest's muzzle. The horse closed its eyes for a beat, accepting and returning the four-legged version of a yes to the one who had found the right stall. Eliza joined him, her hand slipping into his, a gesture no longer needing permission, for the house had agreed. She looked around. The blue ribbon on the east still swayed in rhythm, the glossy EJ board under MSG. Her grandmother's locket chimed softly. Her mother's locket hung on its own hook. Porch lights glowed golden light, lingering on a spur scratch left inadvertently, a beautiful scratch telling the story of someone arriving, standing, and leaving. Eliza squeezed Jake's hand, lifted her eyes bright with the cold wind, not anything else. "We've arrived here," she said. The words were not a question or boast, just naming a place that both had circled for a long time before finding correctly. Jake bent down, kissing her forehead briefly, short, as removing an extra nail firm as driving a new one into the right hole. "Yeah," he whispered, "and we'll wake early tomorrow." That added line was the afterword of every Western promise. Love is waking early together, hauling water through ditches, drying saddles in the sun, adding stitches when the wind reminds. They stepped into the house. On the shelf, a copper thimble stood between salt and pepper. Beneath it, MSG and EJ formed the kitchen's structural pillar. In the stable, Tempest shifted its feet, snoring softly. A horse knows better sleep when humans have touched the day's mark with the correct letters. On the porch, two pairs of boots were close. On the hooks, two jackets brushed. Outside, yellow leaves fell into the night, like someone scattering grain for peace. Inside, Two hearts beat together the opening rhythm of a thick book whose first page had been written in permanent ink home. Sunset poured across the prairie like a strip of burning silk. Distant winds carried the scent of pine smoke and cattle bells mingling with crickets in the grass. Jake and Eliza sat together on the porch, Boots crossed eyes on the vast land that had witnessed so much change. Jake gently squeezed Eliza's hand, voice husky but firm. "Thank you for showing me there's still hope." Eliza said nothing, resting her head on his shoulder. In that moment, the once lonely cowboy and the woman once cast aside no longer bore their wounds alone. They sat as the evening winds brushed the fence, as the red sky embraced two souls once shattered. In the quiet one, truth revealed itself that no one is too broken to begin again. And sometimes the deepest wounds are the opportunity to change. Far off, Tempest tossed its mane, letting out a long whinny echoing through the valley, as if to stamp this new faith upon the sky that had once collapsed on them. The entire town, this harsh land, now seemed to breathe easier. In the harsh West, love and kindness are the only shelter. Have you ever met someone who made you feel at home? Share your story in the comments below. If you were in the cowboy's boots, would you stay to protect the town or ride off into the wild? Let me know in the comments.